When most people hear the phrase colonial America, they instantly picture structured English towns, quiet wooden churches, and disciplined red-coated soldiers marching along cobblestone streets. But the true story of America begins long before any English, Spanish, or French flag was ever raised on this continent, originating in a heavily fractured and majestic landscape that modern travelers would find entirely unrecognizable in its wild, uncorrupted state. For thousands of years, this vast land was the vibrant home to hundreds of indigenous nations, each with its own rich history, unique music, complex politics, and sophisticated culture. To truly understand colonial America, we cannot simply begin with the arrival of European ships. We have to begin with the intricate world that already existed here, and then watch how the first European contacts deeply disturbed and permanently transformed it. As you listen tonight, let the centuries pass softly, and let the long, rhythmic story of the early American landscape carry your mind into a deep and peaceful rest. Before we step completely through the heavy gates of the ancient world, and as you make yourself entirely comfortable in the quiet of the evening, take a gentle moment to dim your lights, leave a like, and subscribe to our channel. If you connect with these deep historical journeys, please share your thoughts with me in the comments below, as hearing from you is always an absolute honor. Where are you listening from tonight, and what hour of the night is it for you right now? Seeing your footsteps gather here from all corners of the world to share in these memories always brings a deep, unspeakable joy to this archive. Now, let the outside world fade into total silence, breathe deeply, and let our journey begin. Long before Europeans ever crossed the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, human communities had already spread across every ecological niche of North America. Following the dramatic end of the last ice age, small, highly adaptable bands of hunter-gatherers were moving meticulously through dense forests, expansive plains, and rugged coasts, following the migrations of great animal herds and the seasonal cycles of native plants over many generations. These mobile groups developed into entirely distinct nations, languages, and cultures, perfectly adapted to the environments they inhabited. Some communities remain mainly hunters and fishers, mastering the resources of the sea and the rivers, while others slowly and systematically shifted toward sophisticated farming, especially in areas where the climate and alluvial soil were favorable. The agricultural revolution in North America was centered around the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, a vital triad of crops deeply revered as the Three Sisters in many indigenous traditions. When planted together, these crops mutually supported one another, preserving the nutrients of the soil, preventing weed growth, and providing a remarkably balanced and sustainable nutritional base. The success of this agricultural template allowed populations to expand rapidly, supporting larger, permanent settlements and giving rise to significantly more complex, stratified societies. In the eastern woodlands, a magnificent series of earthwork-building cultures rose and fell across the centuries, leaving an indelible mark upon the topography of the continent. Among them were the ancient Adena and Hopewell traditions, whose people meticulously constructed large, geometric ceremonial mounds and created extensive, long-distance trade networks that stretched across much of North America, exchanging precious copper, marine shells, and volcanic stone. Centuries later, what historians now call the Mississippian culture emerged as a dominant civilizational force, centered in the rich river valleys of what is today the southeastern and midwestern United States. This culture achieved an extraordinary peak of urbanization, manifested most spectacularly in the ancient city of Cahokia, located near present-day Illinois. At its historical height, around the 11th century of the Common Era, Cahokia grew into a major population center that rivaled contemporary European cities, housing thousands of residents and dominated by Monk's Mound, a colossal, flat-topped earthwork plaza that served as the political and spiritual heart of the community. The Mississippian world was not an isolated phenomenon. It was the hub of a vast continental economic system, linking distant, diverse communities through the highly organized trade of ritual items, precious stone, and agricultural food surpluses. Farther north, in the region of the Great Lakes and the Northeast Woodlands, other powerful political confederacies took shape, demonstrating a sophisticated mastery of diplomacy and statecraft. One of the most famous and enduring of these alliances was the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy, which united several distinct nations into a singular political structure designed to balance warfare, trade, and regional diplomacy. These alliances were far more than loose, temporary friendships based on shared enemies. They were governed by formal grand councils, strict oral laws, and long-term constitutional agreements, such as the Great Law of Peace. They managed collective decision-making with a remarkable standard of democratic representation and balance, serving as models of political organization that some European observers later found deeply striking when they first arrived on the continent. Concurrently, in the arid and semi-arid environments of the Southwest, indigenous farmers developed highly advanced, intricate irrigation systems to systematically draw precious water from deep rivers and channel it across dry ground. The ancestors of the Pueblo peoples built magnificent, multi-story dwellings of stone and adobe masonry, with some communities setting their complex towns high within protected desert cliffs. Their highly organized urban spaces and sacred underground ceremonial chambers, known as kivas, show careful planning, architectural sophistication, and a profound, long-term adaptation to an often harsh and unforgiving environment. Meanwhile, along the Pacific Northwest coast, where the mountains met the rich waters of the ocean, other wealthy nations relied heavily on the seasonal salmon runs and maritime trades to support incredibly dense, settled populations. Their highly stratified societies expressed their local identities, ancestral lineages, and spiritual beliefs through beautifully carved wooden longhouses, towering totem poles, and elaborate potlatch ceremonies of gift-giving and status validation. What all of these diverse societies across the continent fundamentally had in common was not a single, shared language or uniform culture, but a deep, unyielding history on the land. Religious traditions, artistic styles, and political structures varied widely from coast to coast. Yet, these hundreds of nations were continuously tied together by ancient trade routes, intermarriage, flexible diplomacy, and sometimes strategic warfare. When European ships finally appeared on the western horizon, they did not encounter a blank slate or a wild, untamed new world. They stepped directly into an ancient, already deeply connected world, with its own established rules, long histories, and delicate balances of power. The first known European visitors to North America were not Spanish conquistadors seeking instant gold, nor were they English gentlemen looking to establish permanent tobacco plantations. Centuries before the grand colonial projects of the early modern era took shape, Norse seafarers from Scandinavia had already pushed the boundaries of the known world, sailing their open wooden longships across the cold, volatile waters of the North Atlantic. Around the end of the first millennium of the Common Era, during an era of remarkable maritime expansion, these Norse sailors pushed westward from their established colonies in Iceland and Greenland, driven by a desire for raw resources, timber, and new land to pasture their livestock. For multiple generations, the primary historical records of these western voyages existed only within the oral traditions of the Icelandic sagas, specifically the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. These poetic narratives described bold expeditions led by figures like Leif Erikson to a distant, mysterious land. They officially named Vinland, a region characterized by dense forests, abundant salmon, and wild grapes, somewhere along the northeastern coast of North America. For a long time, mainstream historians and archaeologists debated how much of these dramatic stories was rooted in actual historical truth, and how much was simply the product of medieval folklore or romanticized legend. That historical skepticism was permanently shattered in the middle of the 20th century. A team of visionary Norwegian researchers and archaeologists uncovered definitive physical evidence of an authentic Norse settlement at a site now known as Lance Meadows, situated on the remote northern tip of Newfoundland in modern Canada. The meticulous scientific excavations revealed the clear remains of multiple sod-roofed longhouses, a traditional forge used for smelting and working iron, and a collection of distinctly Norse-style artifacts, including a bronze ring-headed pin and a soapstone spindle whorl used for spinning yarn. Subsequent radiocarbon and tree ring dating confirmed that the site was actively occupied around the early 11th century of the Common Era, matching the rough chronological timeline preserved so faithfully within the sagas. Yet, despite their extraordinary maritime skill and technological capabilities, this initial contact did not lead to a lasting or transformative European colonization of the continent. Archaeological evidence and textual hints within the sagas suggest that the settlement at Lance or Meadows was never intended to be a permanent, expanding colony. Instead, it operated primarily as a strategic base camp and ship repair station for seasonal exploration and resource gathering. The discovery of specific items within the ruins, such as butternuts and wood from white walnut trees, which do not grow natively in the cold climate of Newfoundland, strongly suggests that Norse expeditions regularly traveled much farther south along the Atlantic coast, venturing into warmer regions where those trees and wild grapes thrived. The decision to eventually abandon Vinland and withdraw entirely back to Greenland and Iceland was likely the result of several overlapping structural challenges. The small number of Norse settlers meant they lacked the demographic weight to sustain a colony so far from their primary supply networks, and the immense distances across a stormy, unpredictable ocean made communication and reinforcements incredibly fragile. Furthermore, the sagas document immediate and increasingly violent conflicts with the native, indigenous populations, whom the Norse generically labelled Skraelings. Lacking a decisive military or numerical advantage over the well-organized local nations, the Norse found the cost of defending their small frontier outposts to be unsustainably high. Once the Norse seafarers completely withdrew their ships from the shores of North America, their brief presence faded into memory, leaving no lasting, long-term genetic, technological, or political effects on the overall balance of power among the indigenous nations of the mainland. For the native communities of the Northeast, life continued precisely as it had for centuries before, shaped fundamentally by local tribal rivalries, intricate trade networks, regional diplomacy, and ecological cycles, rather than by the fleeting visits of strange travelers from across the Northern Sea. The continent returned to its deep historical rhythms, its thousands of diverse societies continuing to develop, adapt, and build their civilizations in isolation from the European world, entirely unaware of the massive, world-altering demographic and imperial storms that were gathering along the global horizon. The more transformative and relentlessly aggressive wave of European arrivals began in the late 15th century of the Common Era, driven not by random curiosity, but by profound structural transformations unfolding inside Europe itself. Powerful kingdoms such as Castile, Aragon, Portugal, England, and France were rapidly consolidating their centralized royal power, subduing internal feudal rivalries, and competing fiercely with one another for dominance over global trade routes. For generations, the old overland commercial paths to the wealthy markets of Asia had been controlled by powerful middleman empires, making luxury commodities exceedingly expensive and contested. This dynamic created an immense financial and geopolitical incentive for Western European crowns to invest heavily in finding new maritime paths to wealth, focusing their absolute energy on securing direct access to exotic spices, raw gold, and silver. Concurrently, rapid advances in deep-sea ship design, such as the development of the maneuverable caravel, paired with sophisticated improvements in navigation tools like the astrolabe and magnetic compass, made prolonged transoceanic voyages far more feasible than ever before. At the same time, religious fervor ran exceptionally high. Christian monarchs saw overseas exploration as a divine opportunity to aggressively spread their faith across the globe and strategically outflank both Muslim powers and rival European states. It was within this highly competitive and expansionist context that Christopher Columbus sailed boldly westward across the Atlantic under the flag of the Spanish crown, making landfall in the Caribbean at the very end of the 15th century. While Columbus's historic voyages did not reach the North American mainland that would later host the English colonies, his arrival permanently opened the floodgates of European exploration, resource extraction, and military conquest throughout the Americas. Within a few short decades, well-equipped Spanish expeditions and heavily armed settlers were moving aggressively into regions that are now parts of the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and the far southern areas of what is today the United States. Concurrently, French fishermen and daring maritime explorers were beginning to appear along the cold North Atlantic coasts, drawn initially by the spectacularly rich cod fisheries of the Grand Banks, and later by the highly lucrative commercial fur trade of the interior river valleys. For the indigenous peoples of North America, these initial waves of contact brought a volatile mixture of strategic opportunities and extreme, unprecedented dangers. On the one hand, advanced European metal tools, fine-woven cloth, and gunpowder weapons entered existing native trade networks and were rapidly adopted into local economies. Some ambitious indigenous groups skillfully used these new luxury goods and foreign alliances to significantly strengthen their political positions against traditional tribal rivals. On the other hand, Europeans also brought something entirely invisible, completely uncontrollable, and far more deadly than any iron blade or blast of gunpowder: old-world diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. These devastating illnesses spread with terrifying velocity because the peoples of the Americas had spent millennia in geographic isolation, meaning they possessed no prior biological exposure and therefore no inherited genetic immunity to these foreign pathogens. In many regions, deadly epidemics spread far ahead of direct European physical settlement, carried along the ancient native trade routes that connected distant villages, agricultural centers, and distinct nations. The cumulative result over time was a catastrophic, heartbreaking loss of human life across the continent. In some coastal and river valley regions, entire communities were completely wiped out or reduced to a mere fraction of their former demographic numbers within a single generation. This sweeping demographic collapse severely weakened long-standing political structures, deeply disrupted seasonal agricultural cultivation, and created massive, vulnerable openings for European powers to insert themselves into indigenous politics. The newcomers functioned as highly unpredictable, dangerous new players in an arena where the ancient balances of power were being systematically shattered. Indigenous societies were never passive victims in this chaotic process. They adapted, resisted, negotiated, and fought with extraordinary resilience. Yet, the sheer scale and unprecedented speed of change, especially through recurring epidemic disease, created profound systemic strains that no human community could fully control. As European exploration steadily turned into permanent territorial conquest, two powerful crowns moved first and most aggressively into the immense lands that would shape the future layout of North America: Spain and France. Long before English ships planted their fragile, chaotic beachheads on the Atlantic coast, Spanish military garrisons, religious missions, and farming towns already dotted the far south and southwest, while French traders and dedicated missionaries were quietly building their own extensive commercial network along northern rivers and dense forests. Understanding these two rival empires explains the complex political map that English colonists later walked into, as well as the difficult, high-stakes choices that indigenous nations had to make in a rapidly transforming world. Spain's immense geopolitical strength came from its earlier, spectacularly lucrative conquests farther south, especially across the islands of the Caribbean and the great empires of Mesoamerica and the Andes. From those wealthy, highly centralized centers of power, Spanish royal officials looked northward, viewing the vast lands they officially called La Florida, and the far interior not as empty spaces to be ignored, but as a crucial, strategic, defensive frontier. This northern frontier was explicitly engineered to shield the wealthy treasure fleets sailing from the Caribbean back to Europe from piracy, and to block rival European powers before they could gain a permanent, dangerous foothold on the mainland. Along the southeastern Atlantic coast, Spanish commanders launched repeated, heavily armed expeditions to claim deep harbors, construct stone forts, and forcefully curb French imperial ambitions. In the middle of the 16th century, after a brief and highly unstable French Huguenot presence at Fort Caroline, near the modern coast of the southeastern United States. Spanish forces, under the iron-willed command of Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, launched a devastating surprise attack and completely destroyed the French outpost. Soon after, in the year 1565, Spain successfully founded a permanent settlement at a place now known as St. Augustine, in present-day Florida, an outpost that would officially become the oldest continuously inhabited European established community in what became the continental United States. The cause and effect chain of this event was remarkably clear on the global stage. French attempts to plant strategic colonies along the southeastern coast had triggered a decisive, merciless military response from the Spanish crown. By wiping out Fort Caroline and rapidly securing St. Augustine, Spain signaled to all other European powers that it claimed not just lucrative islands in the Caribbean, but a broad, sweeping arc of mainland coastline as well. Indigenous peoples living near these new Spanish military posts, including the Timucua and various other groups in the Florida region, suddenly found themselves drawn into an intense colonial rivalry they had not chosen, forced to continuously navigate new alliances, unprecedented trade opportunities, and structural military threats to their ancestral independence. Farther inland and to the west, Spanish expeditions moved boldly into the arid and semi-arid regions that would eventually be called New Mexico, Texas, and California. In these vast desert landscapes, Spanish imperial strategies blended raw military force with the institutionalized religious mission system. Catholic friars, particularly from the Franciscan order, established permanent missions near existing indigenous communities, aiming to systematically convert the native populations to Christianity and bring them into a settled, European-style way of agricultural life. Concurrently, soldiers constructed presidios, or fortified garrisons, to protect these isolated missions and to forcefully project royal authority deep into what is now New Mexico. This rigid pattern of colonization quickly led to deep, smoldering cultural tensions. The Pueblo peoples, who possessed long, illustrious traditions of settled village life, advanced agriculture, and complex religious ceremonies, were heavily targeted by Franciscan missionary campaigns that sought to forcefully suppress traditional beliefs, systematically dismantle sacred practices, and impose Christian rituals. Furthermore, Spanish officials demanded regular native labor and material tribute, placing heavy economic burdens on the local communities. The combination of religious suppression, forced labor, and periodic outbursts of colonial violence created a mounting, volatile reservoir of resentment among the villages. This intense pressure finally exploded in the cataclysmic event now recognized as the Pueblo Revolt in the late 17th century. Under the brilliant, highly secretive leadership of figures such as Pope of the San Juan Pueblo, a broad, unprecedented alliance of distinct Pueblo communities coordinated a massive, simultaneous uprising that completely overran Spanish defenses, driving the settlers, soldiers, and friars entirely out of the province for a period of 12 years. The revolt did not happen out of nowhere. It grew structurally from decades of coercion and cultural assault, beautifully demonstrating that indigenous peoples could still act collectively to push back a powerful empire when pushed to their limits. Spain eventually re-established its rule in the region, but on significantly altered, more cautious terms. Spanish authorities became far less aggressive about directly attacking Pueblo spiritual life, and local alliances shifted once again to focus on mutual defense against nomadic raiding tribes. The larger historical pattern here is highly important. Spanish power in North America was real, institutionalized, and often exceptionally harsh, but it was never absolute. It depended continuously on negotiations, pragmatic compromises, and complex military calculations that took indigenous agency seriously, even when official royal rhetoric tried to deny it. While Spain was busy constructing its rigid network of stone presidios and Franciscan missions across the sun-drenched landscapes of the south and southwest, a completely different European empire was rapidly taking shape in the colder, heavily forested lands to the north and northeast. French ambitions in North America centered less on the immediate aggressive extraction of precious gold or silver, and far more on the highly organized, incredibly profitable international traffic in furs. From the early 17th century onward, intrepid French explorers, merchant traders, and dedicated missionaries methodically worked their way along the vast Lawrence River, the expansive Great Lakes, and eventually down the entire Mississippi River system, creating a sprawling, fluid, water-based empire that would be officially known to the world as New France. One of the absolute foundational figures in this northern colonial narrative was Samuel de Champlain, a brilliant, iron-willed navigator and cartographer who is frequently celebrated as the father of New France. Champlain recognized with complete clarity that the strategic geography of the northern river valleys could not be held through brute military force alone. In the year 1608, he successfully established a permanent French settlement at a high, defensible cliff along the St. Lawrence River named Quebec. From this fledgling outpost, Champlain immediately began to cultivate deep, mutually beneficial diplomatic and economic alliances with local indigenous nations, most notably the Huron-Wendat Confederacy and various Algonquian-speaking groups. For Champlain and successive French colonial administrators, these indigenous alliances were not an optional diplomatic luxury. They were an absolute structural necessity for survival. The total number of French settlers across North America remained exceptionally small compared to the massive demographic waves that would later define English colonization, and the early outposts depended entirely on native partners who possessed an intimate, generational knowledge of the rugged terrain, the hidden river portages, and the seasonal rhythms of hunting and harvesting. The cause and effect chain of the northern fur trade stood out sharply on the economic map of the Atlantic world. The entire system relied fundamentally on indigenous trappers and skilled middlemen who gathered high-quality beaver pelts from deep within the continental interior and funneled them systematically down the river networks toward French trading posts like Quebec and Montreal. In return for these valuable pelts, which were in massive demand across Europe for the manufacture of luxury hats, indigenous communities received an array of advanced European manufactured goods, including sharp iron axes, brass kettles, woolen cloth, glass beads, and firearms. The French presence thus intensified existing native trade networks, but it also fundamentally transformed them, introducing powerful new economic pressures, commercial dependencies, and deadly military technologies into ancient indigenous rivalries. Following close behind the merchant traders into the deep wilderness were the French missionaries, particularly the highly educated and disciplined priests of the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits. Unlike the Spanish Franciscans, who frequently relied on military presidios to forcefully herd native populations into structured mission towns, the Jesuits adopted a far more flexible, intellectually immersive strategy of conversion. They lived directly among the indigenous communities, traveling with them on seasonal hunts, learning local languages with remarkable precision, and meticulously writing detailed ethnographical reports back to Europe, which were compiled into the famous volumes known as the Jesuit Relations. Among the Huron-Wendat, for example, Jesuit missionaries established specialized mission villages and worked tirelessly to reshape daily indigenous life according to European and Christian religious models. These spiritual efforts were sometimes welcomed as a source of cultural renewal, sometimes tolerated as an economic necessity to preserve French trade monopolies, and frequently fiercely resisted as a dangerous, supernatural threat to ancestral social structures. For some native individuals, a formal alliance with French missionaries or undergoing Christian baptism offered exclusive access to firearms or protection from devastating colonial epidemics. For others, the presence of the black-robed priests was viewed as a toxic, destabilizing element that fractured traditional tribal unity and invited the anger of local spiritual guardians. The French approach to empire was therefore fundamentally different from the Spanish template of heavily fortified administrative towns and rigid, coercive missionary control, but it remained a highly ambitious, profoundly imperial project nonetheless. French officials boldly claimed executive sovereignty over millions of square miles of the continental interior, sometimes executing nothing more than a brief, theatrical ceremony on a remote riverbank accompanied by the chanting of hymns and the planting of a wooden cross or royal flag as a legal symbol of possession. The dozens of powerful indigenous nations whose ancestral homelands were thus being claimed on paper were rarely consulted, and they remained the supreme, undisputed military actors in their own right across the interior plains. Yet on elegant European maps drafted in Paris and London, their ancient hunting grounds increasingly appeared as parts of a distant, absolute king's domain, setting the stage for an explosive era of multi-layered geopolitical competition. As the 17th century progressed, the intense commercial activities of New France rapidly entangled European imperial competition with long-standing indigenous rivalries. The introduction of European manufactured goods, particularly firearms and metal tools, fundamentally altered the stakes of traditional Native American diplomacy and warfare. Control over the major river networks and the primary hunting grounds was no longer just a matter of local tribal prestige. It became a critical issue of economic survival and geopolitical dominance in a rapidly commercializing Atlantic world. The French presence acted as a massive catalyst that disrupted the ancient, delicate balances of power across the northern woodlands. A primary example of this profound destabilization was the multi-generational conflict known to history as the Beaver Wars, which pitted the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy, against the Huron-Wendat and their French-aligned neighbors. The Haudenosaunee, occupying a strategic geographical position in what is now upstate New York, found their local beaver populations rapidly depleted by the mid-17th century due to the intensive trade they conducted with Dutch merchants along the Hudson River. To maintain their access to European tools, textiles, and weaponry, the Iroquois recognized that they had to expand their influence westward and northward, aiming to forcefully seize control of the wealthy fur-trapping territories managed by the Huron-Wendat. Utilizing a highly disciplined military organization and a substantial arsenal of firearms acquired from Dutch and English sources, the Haudenosaunee launched a series of devastating, high-intensity campaigns across the Great Lakes region. They methodically attacked Huron villages, ambushed trading canoes along the Ottawa River, and dismantled the entire commercial network that Champlain had worked so tirelessly to build. By the end of the 1640s, the Huron-Wendat Confederacy was effectively shattered as a major political entity. Its towns were burned to the ground, its agricultural lands were abandoned, and its surviving populations were either forcefully adopted into Iroquois clans or scattered into distant western regions as refugees. The French, bound by deep diplomatic and religious alignments to the Huron, were inevitably pulled into this destructive vortex. The collapse of their primary indigenous trading partners threatened the economic lifeblood of Quebec, forcing French administrators to deploy their own regular troops and construct defensive outposts along the river portages to check the aggressive advance of the Iroquois vanguard. This conflict beautifully illustrates how the mechanics of colonial alliances could drag European powers into complex indigenous wars, and conversely, how politically astute Native American nations could leverage European support, material goods, and military technology to achieve their own independent strategic goals. The human and societal costs of these overlapping conflicts were magnified exponentially by recurring epidemics of European diseases that swept through the crowded interior villages at regular intervals. The combination of industrial-scale warfare, forced demographic displacement, and catastrophic biological loss shattered the ancient social fabrics of dozens of nations. Yet, beneath these tragedies, the historical narrative remained dynamic and active. Indigenous decision-makers across the continent continuously weighed complex risks, negotiated shifting truces, and systematically chose their imperial allies based on a calculated desire to protect their communities in a landscape that had become profoundly more volatile. On elegant parchment maps drafted in the distant royal courts of Madrid, Paris, and London, the North American continent was increasingly carved up into massive, overlapping imperial brackets. Spanish New Spain asserted absolute executive sovereignty over a vast frontier stretching from the Gulf of Mexico across the expansive interior plains and up the Pacific coast. French New France claimed an equally sweeping empire, arching gracefully from the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes, and extending down the entire length of the Mississippi Valley to the shores of Louisiana. In reality, much of this immense geographical space remained firmly under the de facto military and political control of sovereign indigenous nations, with only a few scattered European trading posts or remote mission stations marking the grand ambitions of kings. Still, the formal creation of these imperial claims mattered immensely for the trajectory of global history. When English merchants, adventurous noblemen, and religious dissenters later began to push inland from the narrow Atlantic coastline, they were not entering an empty wilderness or a neutral, unmapped territory. They were walking directly into a continent that had already been structurally bracketed by older, aggressive rival empires. Spanish Florida and the Spanish Southwest operated as a powerful southern fence, guarding the wealth of the Caribbean. New France created a formidable northern and western wall, monopolizing the deep interior waterways. It was precisely between these two established imperial brackets that the first English ventures would have to struggle to take root, turning the eastern seaboard into a high-stakes arena of global competition. By the final decades of the 16th century, England was an ambitious but deeply uneasy island kingdom, standing cautiously on the absolute margins of a rapidly expanding global economy. Across the English Channel, the massive Catholic superpower of Spain appeared to dominate Europe entirely, fueled by an unprecedented, endless influx of raw silver and gold extracted from its great American empires in Mexico and Peru. English monarchs, merchants, and strategic planners watched this massive accumulation of Iberian wealth with growing geopolitical anxiety, deeply worried that if they did not join the global race for overseas territories immediately, their nation would be permanently left behind, surrounded by powerful continental rivals. Compounding these strategic fears were the intense religious conflicts that had violently shaken the internal fabric of the English state for generations. Following decades of shifting theological allegiances between Catholicism and Protestantism, England, under the long reign of Queen Elizabeth I, had taken a strongly, uncompromisingly Protestant direction. Spain, fiercely loyal to the Catholic Counter-Reformation, looked upon the English crown not merely as a geopolitical competitor, but as a dangerous heretical threat that required ultimate containment or outright destruction. This multi-layered friction encouraged English military captains and adventurous noblemen to actively search for any pragmatic methods to systematically weaken Spanish dominance while enriching their own domestic realm. The primary initial method chosen by these English mariners was privateering, a highly institutionalized form of state-sanctioned piracy. Armed with official royal letters of marque, celebrated English sea dogs like Francis Drake and John Hawkins aggressively attacked wealthy Spanish treasure fleets and isolated Caribbean colonies, stealing immense amounts of gold, destroying merchant shipping, and severely disrupting the maritime trade networks of the Iberian crown. While privateering brought immediate, spectacular wealth to individual investors and the royal treasury, visionary strategic promoters of colonization recognized that temporary raids were not enough to secure England's long-term global future. Brilliant intellectual advocates, such as Sir Humphrey Gilbert and his charismatic half-brother, Sir Walter Raleigh, began to compose extensive political treatises, arguing that England must urgently plant its own permanent colonial bases across the Atlantic. They masterfully projected a magnificent blueprint for North America, imagining a continent filled with rich gold mines, fertile agricultural lands capable of producing Mediterranean luxury goods, and vast new markets for English manufactured woolens. Furthermore, these writers framed colonization as a highly logical solution to the severe social and economic problems plaguing the home country. England's domestic population was growing at an unprecedented rate, while the widespread enclosure of traditional agricultural lands for sheep pasturage had thrown hundreds of thousands of ordinary peasants into absolute poverty, homelessness, and structural unemployment. Prominent colonial writers claimed that sending these poor, idle, or criminally inclined people to newly established overseas colonies would simultaneously relieve the intense socio-economic pressures building at home while building England's raw geopolitical strength abroad. Out of this potent mixture of anti-Spanish ambition, commercial calculation, and social engineering came the very first serious English attempt to plant a permanent colony in North America, focusing on a broad, uncharted region they officially named Virginia in honor of their unmarried monarch, Elizabeth I. In the early 1580s, under the direct financial organization and royal patent of Sir Walter Raleigh, small groups of English soldiers and civilian settlers tried to establish a secure base on Roanoke Island, situated just off the treacherous coast of what is today North Carolina. The early expeditions quickly encountered severe logistical difficulties. The shallow coastal waters and shifting sandbars caused catastrophic shipwrecks that ruined vital provisions, while the settlers, lacking agricultural experience, struggled to feed themselves. The first military vanguard grew deeply paranoid and aggressively hostile toward the local indigenous communities, executing local chieftains over minor property disputes and permanently ruining diplomatic relations. While that initial group eventually abandoned the island and fled back to England on a passing ship, Raleigh resolved to launch a second, far more substantial attempt in the year 1587. This new group was deliberately structured to build a true, lasting agrarian community rather than a temporary military outpost, containing over 100 civilian settlers, including intact families, women, and young children, all under the administrative leadership of Governor John White. Shortly after the settlers arrived on the island and began constructing simple wooden homes, the structural fragility of the colony became starkly apparent. Realizing that their agricultural stores were dangerously insufficient to survive the upcoming winter, Governor White was heavily pressured by the colonists to sail back to England to secure urgent provisions and reinforcements. However, when White arrived home, he found his kingdom gripped by an absolute existential crisis. The Spanish Armada was sailing aggressively up the English Channel to launch a full-scale invasion of England. Every available English ship and mariner was immediately conscripted by the Royal Navy to fight for the survival of the realm, completely freezing White's relief mission and cutting Roanoke off from the European world for 3 long, uninterrupted years. When the naval wars finally ceased and English supply ships were finally able to return to the island in the summer of 1590, the mariners stepped ashore into a haunting, absolute silence. The entire settlement was completely deserted, its simple wooden houses carefully dismantled, and the single word Croatoan was found meticulously carved into a primary defensive post, alongside the letters Crow etched into a nearby tree. The definitive fate of this so-called lost colony remains one of the most famous and captivating mysteries in global historical literature, with modern researchers continuing to debate whether the starving colonists succumbed to local epidemic diseases, perished in violent conflicts with hostile tribal groups, or executed a planned relocation to live among friendly indigenous communities on the nearby islands. The absolute material failure of the Roanoke experiment taught English planners a sequence of incredibly hard, vital lessons. Colonies could no longer be treated as quick, highly speculative ventures left to fend for themselves on a distant shoreline. Distance, ocean storms, and European wars made transatlantic supply lines dangerously fragile. To successfully take root in an unfamiliar and often hostile environment, future English settlements would require far more resilient financial backings, meticulous logistical planning, and a stronger, more permanent organizational framework than any single wealthy nobleman could ever personally provide. While the tragic mystery of Roanoke Island faded into legend, the strategic desire within England to establish a permanent presence in North America did not disappear. In the early decades of the 17th century, a profound organizational shift occurred that permanently altered the mechanics of English colonization. Planners realized that relying on the personal fortune of a single nobleman was a recipe for catastrophic financial and physical ruin. To distribute the immense financial risks and maximize potential rewards, a new economic model emerged as the primary vehicle for overseas expansion: the joint stock company. This innovative financial mechanism allowed hundreds of individual investors, ranging from wealthy London merchants to minor country gentry, to pool their capital into a single corporate entity. In exchange for their money, investors received corporate shares, expecting substantial profits if the overseas colony succeeded. This corporate structure turned colonization into a rationalized business venture, grounded in systematic calculation rather than erratic individual adventure. One of the most powerful and politically connected of these new corporations was the Virginia Company of London. In the early 17th century, King James I granted the company a formal royal charter, vesting it with exclusive legal authority, expansive territorial claims, and the right to settle and govern a vast sweep of the North American coastline in the king's name. The company's primary corporate objective was straightforward: find a quick path to wealth, whether through the discovery of precious metals, the locating of a navigable passage to the markets of Asia, or the extraction of high-value raw commodities. In the spring of 1607, the Virginia Company's initial investment materialized on the global stage. 3 small corporate ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, crossed the volatile waters of the Atlantic Ocean under the command of Captain Christopher Newport. After a long, difficult voyage that exhausted their initial provisions, the expedition sailed up a broad river they officially named the James in honor of their monarch. Seeking defense against potential Spanish privateers who might raid the settlement from the sea, the colonists selected a site on a peninsula along the riverbanks to establish their central base. They officially named this fragile wooden outpost Jamestown. This settlement was destined to become the first permanent English colony to endure in North America, though it would do so only by the narrowest of margins. The corporate instructions delivered to the settlers revealed a volatile blend of commercial greed and intense geopolitical fear. They were explicitly commanded to choose a highly defensible site, to watch continuously for hostile Spanish warships, to establish trade relations with local indigenous populations, and, above all else, to locate immediate sources of revenue. However, the human composition of the first wave of colonists introduced a severe structural flaw into the project. A significant portion of the original population were listed as gentlemen, men of noble lineage, who were traditionally unaccustomed to manual labor, along with specialized artisans, soldiers, and personal servants who possessed very little practical experience in clearing wilderness, building sturdy shelters, or cultivating crops in an unfamiliar ecological landscape. Jamestown's physical location, chosen primarily for its military defensive advantages, came with immediate and catastrophic natural drawbacks. The low-lying marshy peninsula was surrounded by stagnant, brackish water that was entirely unsafe for human consumption, and quickly bred swarms of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. The settlers arrived in the midst of a severe regional drought, completely misunderstanding the local ecology and lacking the collective unity to organize effective communal farming. Early historical accounts describe a scene of deep organizational decay, as some men spent their critical initial months searching for imagined gold deposits rather than planting crops or securing a reliable source of fresh water. The human cost of this collective negligence was immediate and merciless. Raging epidemics of typhoid, dysentery, and malaria, combined with severe nutritional starvation and winter exposure, decimated the population. Within the first few months of the settlement, more than half of the original colonists perished behind the wooden palisade walls. The colony's internal leadership was continuously paralyzed by political instability, bitter personal quarrels among the company-appointed officers, and a rapid rotation of ineffective governing councils. Out of these troubled beginnings, a single charismatic figure emerged to impose discipline upon the dying settlement: Captain John Smith. A veteran soldier of fortune who had fought in bloody campaigns across Eastern Europe, Smith possessed a ruthless, pragmatic understanding of survival. He systematically seized control of the colony's governing council, abolished the speculative search for gold, and directed the absolute energy of the remaining men toward practical farming, fortifying the wooden defenses, and digging deep freshwater wells. Smith recognized that the survival of the enterprise depended on an uncompromising enforcement of labor discipline. He famously instituted a strict rule based on biblical principles, declaring to the aristocratic settlers that those who did not actively work would not be permitted to eat. This blunt mandate captured the absolute desperation of the situation, temporarily forcing the fractious population to pull together to avert total extinction. Beyond the fragile wooden walls of Jamestown stretched the expansive and highly organized territory of the Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful network of dozens of related Algonquian-speaking agricultural communities. The English were not entering an empty, unmapped wilderness. They were inserting themselves directly into a sophisticated and densely populated native political landscape. The Confederacy was ruled with an iron hand by a paramount chief named Wahunsenacor, whom the English genericized simply as Powhatan. Powhatan managed a complex tributary empire, controlling trade, diplomacy, and strategic warfare across the entire coastal plain of Virginia. For Chief Powhatan and his political advisors, the sudden arrival of the strange English settlers was viewed as both a potential threat and an intriguing diplomatic opportunity. On one hand, these foreign intruders aggressively claimed land along the river, cut down sacred timber, and frequently attempted to seize native agricultural stores without proper diplomatic protocol. On the other hand, they possessed advanced metal tools, sharp iron axes, valuable copper ornaments, and devastating firearms that could be exceptionally useful to Powhatan in subduing his traditional tribal rivals in the interior highlands. Consequently, Powhatan adopted a calculated strategy of containment and conditional assistance. At multiple critical junctures during the first 2 years, when the English were completely paralyzed by winter famine, Powhatan's people delivered massive quantities of corn and venison to the fort, effectively choosing to keep the strangers alive as potential clients or trade partners within their wider political orbit. At other times, when the English pushed too aggressively into native fields, hostility flared instantly into localized skirmishes, ambushes, and hostage-taking on both sides. The famous narrative of Pocahontas, Chief Powhatan's young daughter, boldly offering her own body to save Captain John Smith from an execution ceremony, appears exclusively within Smith's later, highly romanticized personal writings, and has been heavily distorted across global popular culture. Modern ethnographical historians heavily debate the factual accuracy and cultural meaning of this event, with many scholars suggesting that if the incident occurred, it functioned as a carefully staged, ritualized adoption ceremony. Within this ritual, Smith was symbolically killed as a foreign outsider and reborn as a subordinate tribal chieftain, loyal to Powhatan's overarching authority. Pocahontas did play a highly active role in the volatile communications between the two distinct worlds, frequently appearing in early English ledgers as an envoy who brought vital messages, food supplies, and trade goods into the fort. However, her actual historical trajectory reveals the intense, unequal power dynamics and harsh cultural pressures at work along the early colonial frontier. A few years later, during a period of renewed military conflict, she was captured by the English, held as a political hostage on a ship, systematically converted to Christianity under the name Rebecca, and married to an ambitious English colonist named John Rolfe. She was eventually transported across the Atlantic to London, where she was paraded through the royal court as a highly visible symbol of supposed racial harmony and successful cultural assimilation. Her tragic death from an old-world disease on the eve of her return voyage beautifully illustrated the deep, dangerous biological currents that continuously undermined the fragile peace of the early American landscape. As Jamestown staggered through its first 5 years of existential misery, the Virginia Company of London continued to pour massive amounts of capital and thousands of new settlers into the project, desperately trying to save its investment from total liquidation. The corporate leaders in London continuously pressed the colonial governors for immediate financial returns, completely failing to comprehend the harsh material realities of the frontier. This permanent tension between economic expectation and devastating physical reality shaped a highly erratic colonial policy. Certain periods saw the implementation of incredibly strict military discipline, known as the laws divine, moral, and martial, which punished minor agricultural infractions or absenteeism with public whipping, imprisonment, or execution. Other periods involved desperate promises of free land grants and political rights to attract a higher volume of voluntary labour from England. The absolute nadir of the Jamestown venture arrived during the winter of 1609 and 1610, an apocalyptic epoch permanently etched into historical literature as the Starving Time. Following a severe injury from a gunpowder explosion, Captain John Smith was forced to sail back to England, leaving the colony without an iron-willed central coordinator. Concurrently, Chief Powhatan, growing increasingly wary of the endless influx of English migrants, instituted a suffocating military blockade around the fort, cutting off all incoming trade, communication, and agricultural food supplies. The interior of Jamestown rapidly descended into an absolute humanitarian catastrophe. The marooned settlers, consumed by raging famine and freezing winter conditions, devoured their remaining livestock, their horses, their domestic dogs, and eventually the rats that infested the wooden cabins. As the weeks dragged on relentlessly, desperation shattered all social norms, with contemporary legal records and modern archaeological excavations providing grim, indisputable evidence of survival cannibalism among the dying colonists. By the time the spring thaw finally arrived, only a hollowed-out fraction of the population remained alive behind the decaying palisades. The survivors were so thoroughly traumatized that they actually boarded their remaining ships and set sail down the James River with the explicit intent of abandoning Virginia forever. However, as they neared the mouth of the river, they encountered an advancing vanguard of 3 new ships commanded by Lord de la Warr, who arrived with fresh troops, extensive provisions, and an absolute royal mandate to re-establish imperial control, turning the fleeing colonists back to the marsh of Jamestown and preventing the corporate experiment from joining Roanoke in total collapse. When Jamestown finally moved beyond the edge of absolute collapse, its transition into a permanent, expanding society did not rest upon the discovery of rich gold mines, mountain silver, or exotic treasures. Its long-term survival and spectacular economic success rested on something far more ordinary, terrestrial, and dangerous: a leaf. Tobacco turned the struggling Virginia settlement into the absolute center of a land-hungry, labor-hungry plantation society. Around this single commercial crop, a distinctive Chesapeake world took shape, linking massive wealth, political power, and racial structures in ways that would fundamentally define the future of colonial America. The key historical transformation was not the mere discovery that tobacco could grow within the soil of Virginia. Indigenous peoples across the region had long cultivated, processed, and utilized native varieties of tobacco in their religious ceremonies, diplomatic protocols, and everyday social life. What the colonists did, under the direction of an ambitious planter named John Rolfe, was systematically import a sweeter, far more desirable seed strain from the Spanish Caribbean, and develop a sophisticated style of curing that perfectly suited European tastes and could be sold on a massive industrial scale. Once the corporate planners realized they could ship vast quantities of this cured Virginia tobacco across the Atlantic and find an insatiable market, the primary goals of the settlement shifted permanently. Survival was still important, but corporate profit now stood just as high. Tobacco was an incredibly demanding crop that fundamentally re-architected both the physical landscape and the social relations of the colony. The plant rapidly drained vital nutrients from the soil, meaning that individual fields could not be planted with tobacco year after year without losing their productivity entirely. Ambitious planters required a constant supply of fresh ground, systematically clearing ancient forests along the banks of navigable rivers and creeks, where the alluvial soil was rich and direct transport by boat was easy. This ecological dynamic created an almost constant, aggressive push outward from the original fortified settlement into the surrounding native countryside. As small clearings rapidly spread into massive, sprawling plantations, the landscape began to look less like a defensive military outpost and more like a vast patchwork of rural farms and private estates strung out along waterways. This territorial expansion had immediate, devastating consequences for the indigenous nations living nearby. As English settlers claimed more and more acreage for tobacco and sustenance corn, they systematically encroached upon native hunting grounds, seasonal village sites, and sacred places. Formal agreements, boundaries, and truces might set out specific territorial lines for a time, but the relentless pressure for arable land never truly eased. For colonial leaders, any unused or lightly used land, as they imagined it through a European legal lens, seemed like an unacceptable waste. For indigenous communities, those same spaces formed a critical part of a larger pattern of seasonal migration, hunting, and spiritual life. These two incompatible ways of understanding the land collided again and again along the expanding frontier. Inside the colony, the rapid growth of tobacco planting raised another urgent structural problem: labor. Tobacco was an exceptionally labor-intensive crop that required meticulous, year-round attention. Fields had to be cleared of heavy timber, fenced against livestock, planted, continuously weeded, harvested, and carefully cured inside specialized wooden barns. For ambitious planters, the primary challenge was no longer finding a reliable market, but finding enough hands to do the physical work. The small number of colonists who had come to the region as corporate shareholders or high officials could not possibly manage these expanding tracts on their own. In these early decades, the main historical answer to this systemic labor shortage was neither advanced machinery nor a massive influx of enslaved Africans, but a group of people known as indentured servants. Many of them were poor, displaced men and women from England, Ireland, and other parts of the British Isles who had been marginalized by economic changes at home. They agreed to sign a formal legal contract, or indenture, binding themselves to work for a specific master in the colony for a fixed number of years, often ranging from 4 to 7. In exchange for their labor, they received passage across the ocean, basic food and shelter during their term, and the promise of freedom dues at the end of their contract, which typically included new clothing, agricultural tools, or a small piece of land. From the viewpoint of the colonial elites, this system possessed two immense advantages. It supplied the desperately needed labor to maximize tobacco production, and it allowed them to portray the colony as a place of upward social mobility. An indentured servant might endure years of grueling work, severe discipline, and rampant disease, but in theory, absolute freedom waited at the end of the contract. For many servants, especially those who managed to survive the harsh seasoning process of local climate and diseases, that hope was real, even if it was frequently disappointed by the lack of prime land available to newcomers. To encourage continuous investment in land and people, colonial authorities and company leaders developed strategic policies that directly linked immigration to property ownership. One of the most important was the headright system. Under this arrangement, anyone who paid for the transatlantic passage of a laborer or other migrant to Virginia could legally claim a grant of land, often 50 acres per transported person. That meant wealthy individuals who possessed the capital to sponsor several indentured servants could steadily build up massive, contiguous estates along the prime riverfronts. Over time, this created a sharp, visible contrast within the colony. On one side stood a growing, tightly knit class of large planters with riverfront estates, control over dozens of servants, and an increasing say in the local House of Burgesses. On the other side stood small farmers, landless freemen who had completed their indentures but found little good land left near the coast, and the servants still bound to their contracts. Even at this early stage, the Chesapeake was not a simple land of broad equality. An early form of a class system was taking shape, resting entirely on who controlled land and workers. While Virginia was moving in this agrarian direction, another Chesapeake colony entered the picture: Maryland. Founded under the leadership of Cecilius Calvert, also known as Lord Baltimore, Maryland's royal charter granted it to the Calvert family as a proprietary colony. This meant that in law, the Calverts enjoyed almost princely authority within their territory, though still under the overarching sovereignty of the English crown. Maryland was also intentionally designed as a safe refuge for English Catholics who faced systemic discrimination and periods of harsh persecution at home. In practice, the colony quickly included a large number of Protestants as well, with intense religious tension and political compromise shaping its early assemblies. Economically, however, Maryland quickly came to resemble its southern neighbor. its alluvial soils and temperate climate perfectly suited tobacco cultivation. Its extensive river networks offered ideal routes for shipping, and its leaders deployed remarkably similar strategies of headright land grants and labor importation. Together, Virginia and Maryland formed the agricultural core of the Chesapeake region, linked tightly by the international tobacco trade and by shared, durable patterns of settlement and social order. At this stage, the line between different kinds of unfree labor in the Chesapeake was still significantly more fluid than it would later become. Alongside English and Irish indentured servants, there were also Africans working in the fields, the first of whom had arrived in 1619 aboard a Dutch warship. Some were treated as lifelong slaves, others were held as servants for long terms, and at least a few successfully gained their freedom, acquired land, and even commanded their own laborers. Court records and scattered references from the era show a range of statuses, from enslaved laborers to free black property holders who actively participated in local economic life. Yet beneath this surface variety, important changes were already underway. Planters had strong reasons to prefer workers who could be compelled to labor for a lifetime and whose children would also be bound to service. Indentured servants, once free, might compete for land and turn their anger against the ruling class. European wars and changing conditions in England could also rapidly reduce the number of poor migrants willing to sign indentures. Africans brought by force through the Atlantic slave trade offered a different source of labor, one that colonial elites increasingly tried to lock into a permanent hereditary system of slavery. Law became a crucial tool in this shift. Over several decades, the colonial assemblies in Virginia and Maryland passed a series of strict statutes that systematically narrowed the possibilities for Africans and their descendants. These laws made it clear that status as a slave flowed directly through the mother, ensuring that children born to enslaved women would also be enslaved. They restricted the rights of black people, whether enslaved or free, to bear arms, testify against white persons in court, or gather freely. Christianity, which had once been seen by some as a path that might lead to legal freedom, was redefined in the law so that conversion did not alter an enslaved person's status. The cumulative effect was to harden the boundaries of race and bondage. What had once been a somewhat mixed system of unfree labor, in which poor Europeans and Africans shared some similar hardships, increasingly became a racialized system in which blackness was closely linked to permanent enslavement. White servants might still face brutal conditions, but they could look forward to eventual freedom. Enslaved Africans and African Americans were trapped in a structure that offered no such release. Tensions within the white population did not vanish, however. As more former servants completed their terms, some found that the best lands near the coast and along the main rivers were tightly controlled by entrenched planters. These newcomers often had to push into more marginal inland areas, closer to territories still claimed by indigenous peoples and farther from the centers of trade and power. They were vulnerable to conflicts on the frontier and felt neglected by colonial governments that seemed more concerned with the interests of wealthy landowners. One dramatic eruption of these tensions came in Virginia in the later 17th century, in an uprising commonly known as Bacon's Rebellion. Nathaniel Bacon, a member of the colonial elite, but outside the innermost circle of power, became a focal point for settlers frustrated with Governor William Berkeley's leadership. These settlers were angry about limitations on expansion, conflicts with indigenous groups, and a sense that the governor and his allies cared more about their own profits from the fur trade than about frontier security. Under Bacon's leadership, rebels attacked indigenous communities, some of which had not posed a direct threat, and then turned their anger against the colonial government itself. At one point, they even burned parts of Jamestown. The rebellion eventually collapsed after Bacon's death and the arrival of English troops, but it left deep marks on Virginia's ruling class. They saw clearly how quickly discontented white settlers and servants could turn their weapons not only against indigenous peoples, but against colonial authorities. In the aftermath, there is evidence that Virginia's leaders worked deliberately to tighten racial divisions. By offering small but meaningful advantages to poor whites, and by further restricting the rights of Africans and African Americans, They encouraged a sense of shared whiteness that cut across class lines. This strategy did not erase economic inequality, but it helped redirect anger that might have been aimed at elites toward racialized control over black labor. Thus, out of tobacco fields and power struggles, emerged a Chesapeake society with several defining features. Land was the key measure of wealth, and large tracts were increasingly concentrated in the hands of a planter elite. Labor was organized through a mixture of indentured servitude and more race-based slavery. Political influence rested heavily with landowners who sat in colonial assemblies, managed local courts, and controlled the institutions that wrote and enforced the laws. This system tied the Chesapeake tightly into an Atlantic economy. Tobacco flowed out in ships bound for English ports, where it was taxed, traded, and consumed. Manufactured goods, tools, and some luxury items flowed back in. At the same time, though less visible in everyday colonial politics, slave ships carried human beings from the African coast to plantations in the Americas, including the Chesapeake, proving the region was part of a larger web of exchange, linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. When we move from the wide tidewater rivers of the Chesapeake to the rocky, windswept shores of New England, we enter a completely different colonial world. Here, the driving force of society was not the cultivation of a single lucrative cash crop, but the uncompromising execution of a powerful, shared religious vision. The thousands of men, women, and children who crossed the volatile waters of the Atlantic Ocean to settle in this northern region were not simply looking for expansive tobacco lands or immediate mercantile profit. Many of them believed, with absolute certainty, that they were participating in a sacred, divinely orchestrated mission, tasked with building what one of their leaders famously called a city on a hill, a godly, visible community that the entire world would watch. To fully comprehend that vision and the society it constructed, we have to look back directly at the intense religious struggles shaking the internal fabric of England. During the later 16th and early 17th centuries, England was officially a Protestant kingdom, governed by the established Church of England. However, many deeply devout believers felt that the national church had not broken far enough from Catholic traditions, rituals, and hierarchies. These zealous reformers, often labeled generically as Puritans, wanted a significantly plainer, scripture-based style of worship and a far stricter, more disciplined moral life across society. They pushed aggressively for structural changes in church government and in daily human behavior, hoping to purify the national institution from within. Yet, these reformers did not agree on how to achieve their ultimate spiritual goals. Some believed they should stay inside the Church of England, continuing to argue and lobby for further reform. Others concluded that the national church was too fundamentally corrupted to be fixed, choosing to separate from it entirely and forming their own small, underground congregations. This latter group, known historically as separatists, faced serious pressure, social harassment, and severe legal danger in England, where refusing to attend the official church or organizing independent religious meetings could bring heavy fines, imprisonment, or worse. One specific community of separatists eventually made the monumental decision to leave not just the national church, but the British Isles entirely. Following a period of unstable exile in the Dutch city of Leiden, where they worried that their children were losing their English identity and language, they successfully arranged passage to North America. Their historic transatlantic journey would eventually lead them to a cold, sheltered shore they named Plymouth, situated on the coastline of New England. These religious travelers are remembered across global historical literature as the Pilgrims. Their historic voyage aboard the Mayflower in the late autumn of 1620 did not go as originally planned. Fierce ocean storms and navigational problems pushed them far north of the Virginia territory they had originally targeted under their land patent. When they finally made landfall along the shores of Cape Cod, the leaders realized they were entirely outside the direct legal authority of the company that had sponsored their journey, creating a volatile situation where some non-Puritan laborers aboard threatened to act with complete independence. The response to this legal vacuum became one of the most celebrated moments in New England's early history. Before stepping on shore, a group of 41 adult male settlers gathered inside the ship's cabin to sign a short, binding agreement, known today as the Mayflower Compact. In plain, direct language, they promised to form a civil body politic, vowing to create and follow just laws for the good of the colony, and to obey the leaders chosen under those laws. It was not a declaration of democracy in the modern political sense, but it did demonstrate a strong commitment to self-government, rooted in mutual promises and shared obligations. In this way, their deeply held religious ideas about a covenant, a binding spiritual agreement between humans and God, profoundly shaped their earthly political life. The first year at Plymouth was exceptionally harsh and deadly. The settlers arrived late in the winter season in a freezing climate they did not fully understand, with dangerously limited food supplies. Nearly half of the population died from disease, malnutrition, and exposure during that single brutal winter. Survival depended heavily on the unexpected assistance of local indigenous peoples, including the Wampanoag Nation. Specific native figures, such as Tisquantum, often called Squanto, played a key role in guiding the newcomers. Tisquantum, who had learned English after earlier contact, kidnapping, and captivity in Europe, taught the struggling settlers how to plant native corn, use fish as fertilizer to enrich the rocky soil, and navigate local fishing and hunting grounds. Mutual cooperation and undercurrents of strategic tension existed side by side along this frontier. But without this early, crucial native help, the Plymouth colony might well have joined Roanoke as another failed experiment on the edge of the continent. While the Pilgrims at Plymouth were struggling to stay alive, a much larger, far wealthier movement was rapidly forming among the non-separating Puritans in England. Growing political pressures, economic challenges, and fears of aggressive anti-Puritan repression by King Charles. I convinced many prominent Puritan leaders that they could no longer achieve their religious goals at home. Instead, they decided to carry their grandest hopes across the ocean. Under a formal royal charter, a group of wealthy Puritan investors and educated leaders organized the Massachusetts Bay Company, planning a large-scale, systematic migration to New England. Unlike many earlier colonial ventures, which were characterized by a scattering of individual adventurers, soldiers, or young indentured laborers, this migration was structured from the absolute outset to build a permanent, stable, and highly disciplined society. It included entire multi-generational families, highly educated ministers, and prosperous merchants, all intent on building a model Christian commonwealth. One of the most important and influential figures in this movement was John Winthrop, a wealthy lawyer who would serve as the long-term governor of the new colony. Before his ship made landfall, Winthrop preached a historic sermon to the assembled passengers, explicitly describing their project as an effort to construct a city upon a hill. If they were faithful to their covenant, he believed their society would show the entire world what a truly Christian society could look like. If they failed, their sins would be visible to all, inviting divine judgment. This powerful moral example shaped the institutions, geography, and daily rhythms of Massachusetts Bay. The Puritans did not come to New England seeking religious freedom for everyone. They came to build a community where their own specific understanding of true religion could guide law, civic worship, and human behavior. Church membership and political life were closely linked, with voting rights in the colony's governing body, the General Court, initially restricted to male church members. At the local level, New England society organized itself around compact towns, rather than scattered plantations. Groups of families settled together near a central meeting house, which served both as a church and as a place for political town meetings. This geographic pattern encouraged close community ties, mutual moral oversight, collective decision-making, and a relatively broad distribution of land among smallholders, creating a resilient social structure that would echo through American history for generations. The same intense commitment to a shared moral vision that held New England towns together also made them deeply suspicious of internal dissent. For the leaders of Massachusetts Bay, true religious liberty meant only the liberty to walk in the right path. Allowing false doctrines or individualistic interpretations to spread unchecked was viewed not as tolerance, but as a dangerous sin that could break their covenant with God and bring down divine wrath upon the entire Commonwealth. Consequently, this highly disciplined society was remarkably harsh toward those who challenged its established norms. Local magistrates regularly prosecuted offences such as public drunkenness, swearing, and Sabbath breaking. When individual conscience led highly intelligent, articulate believers to question the underlying structure of church and state, the colony chose strict exclusion over accommodation, banishing dissenters into the uncharted wilderness. The first major internal political challenge to the Puritan orthodoxy was raised by a brilliant, charismatic young minister named Roger Williams. Williams was deeply devout and widely respected for his intellect, but he arrived in New England with radical ideas that struck at the absolute foundation of the colonial project. He argued for a complete, clean separation between civil government and the church, insisting that true faith could never be enforced by earthly magistrates without corrupting the spiritual purity of the gospel. He boldly claimed that the state had no right to punish citizens for their personal religious errors or theological beliefs, so long as they maintained civil peace. Furthermore, Williams shook the political establishment by asserting that the English king had no legitimate right to grant native lands to colonists, declaring that the royal patent was invalid, and that settlers must fairly purchase property directly from the sovereign indigenous nations. For Governor John Winthrop and the General Court of Massachusetts, Williams' ideas were an intolerable threat. His challenge to the royal charter undermined the legal legitimacy of their land claims, and his demand for a wall between church and state threatened to dismantle the close partnership between ministers and magistrates that maintained social order. When Williams stubbornly refused to silence his opinions, the General Court officially declared his teachings to be dangerous and ordered him banished from the Commonwealth. In the dead of winter, facing immediate arrest and forced deportation to England, Williams slipped away from his home, travelling through freezing snow and wilderness. He survived only through the assistance of native allies, including the Narragansett Nation, who sheltered him and eventually sold him a tract of land, where he founded a new settlement he named Providence. Providence was explicitly organized on principles completely opposite to those of Massachusetts Bay. Williams decreed that the settlement would be a haven for absolute liberty of conscience, where no individual would ever be persecuted or punished by the civil government for their religious beliefs. In the years that followed, other nearby towns took shape under similar ideals of tolerance, attracting a diverse array of Baptists, Quakers, and other radical dissenters. These communities eventually joined together under a royal charter as the colony of Rhode Island and Providence plantations. To the Orthodox leaders in Boston, Rhode Island was viewed as a dangerous, chaotic experiment, a literal sink of heretics that threatened to undermine the moral fabric of New England. Yet, its steady survival proved that an alternative model of colonial society was possible, one where the state did not enforce a single, rigid religious vision upon its people. An equally powerful and deeply unsettling challenge arose from within the heart of Boston society, led by a highly intelligent midwife and lay religious leader named Anne Hutchinson. Hutchinson began holding weekly religious meetings in her home, which were enthusiastically attended by dozens of men and women, including prominent merchants and political figures. In these gatherings, she began to offer her own sophisticated interpretations of the minister's weekly sermons, passionately emphasizing the doctrine of a covenant of grace. She argued that true salvation and assurance of divine favor flowed from an immediate, inward experience of the Holy Spirit, rather than from outward obedience to moral laws, church rituals, or the social judgments of the clergy. Puritan authorities watched the rapid growth of Hutchinson's following with mounting anxiety and alarm. In their view, her emphasis on personal revelation and inward assurance dangerously undermined the authority of the ordained ministry, encouraging ordinary individuals to believe they were above the moral law of the community. Furthermore, her prominent role as a woman, speaking publicly and authoritatively about complex theological matters, was viewed as a direct violation of the traditional patriarchal order of the 17th century. As political and religious factions began to form around her teachings, threatening to split the colony during a critical election crisis, The government brought Hutchinson to trial before the General Court. The dramatic proceedings revealed a sharp clash between religious authority and individual conscience. For days, Hutchinson defended herself with remarkable theological skill, matching scriptural citations with her accusers and outmaneuvering the legal traps set by the magistrates. However, the trial reached a definitive turning point when she boldly declared that her understanding of Scripture was rooted in direct, personal revelations from God. This statement confirmed the deepest fears of the court, who viewed claims of private revelation as a pathway to absolute spiritual anarchy. The court judged her teachings to be dangerous, branded her a heretic, and officially banished her from the colony. Accompanied by her family and many loyal supporters, Hutchinson relocated southward, temporarily joining the growing communities of dissenters in Rhode Island before moving toward the volatile borderlands of New Netherland. These dramatic episodes of banishment and internal conflict were not mere footnotes in the history of New England. They demonstrated that the structural unity of the Puritan project depended entirely on constant, aggressive boundary making. The ideal of a unified city on a hill could only be maintained in reality by forcefully expelling those whose conscience or ambition pulled them in different directions. Yet, these acts of exclusion did not silence the voice of dissent. They systematically scattered it into new geographical spaces across the Northeast, creating a more complex, pluralistic, colonial landscape. Even as the leaders of Massachusetts Bay tightened their grip over their compact towns and disciplined congregations, their relations with the indigenous nations beyond their borders were sliding from an uneasy, transactional coexistence into a dark era of open, industrial-scale warfare. As English towns, family farms, and livestock pastures steadily expanded across the Connecticut River Valley, the early patterns of conditional cooperation and trade between New England colonists and native nations gave way to fierce territorial competition. The indigenous societies of the Northeast were not unified under a single political authority. Instead, they operated as distinct, highly competitive sovereign nations that meticulously managed their own diplomatic alignments. Among these groups, the Pequot were a dominant, formidable power in what is now southern New England, controlling lucrative trade networks and fiercely guarding their regional influence against both European newcomers and rival native groups. The structural causes of the Pequot War lay in this intense, multi-layered competition for trade monopolies and land sovereignty. As English settlers pushed aggressively westward from Massachusetts Bay, local misunderstandings over commercial transactions, credit disputes, and sporadic frontier violent incidents quickly multiplied. When an English trader was found killed along the coast, colonial authorities instantly blamed the Pequot, utilizing the event as a strategic pretext to launch a full-scale, punitive military campaign designed to permanently break Pequot economic dominance and secure unconditional access to the fertile river valleys. The conflict that followed in the late 1630s was characterized by an unprecedented standard of total, industrial-scale kinetic violence that deeply shocked the traditional indigenous world. Recognizing that they lacked the raw numbers to wage war on multiple fronts, English commanders skillfully utilized regional, Native American rivalries to their absolute advantage. They forged critical military alliances with the Narragansett and Mohegan nations, who viewed the English as a useful tool to dismantle the power of their traditional Pequot oppressors. This joint colonial native vanguard marched rapidly into Pequot territory, executing a campaign aimed at complete societal destruction rather than conditional submission. The absolute turning point of the war materialized during the horrific assault on the fortified Pequot village of Mystic. In the early hours of the morning, colonial soldiers and their native allies silently encircled the crowded wooden palisade fort, which housed hundreds of Pequot men, women, and children. Meeting fierce, fanatical resistance at the gates, the English commanders made a ruthless tactical decision to abandon traditional close-quarters combat. They systematically set the entire wooden fort on fire, creating a raging inferno that consumed the village within minutes. Colonial soldiers formed a strict perimeter around the blazing walls, mercilessly shooting down any individuals who attempted to escape the flames. Hundreds of non-combatants perished amid the chaotic slaughter, a display of total warfare that deeply horrified even the Narragansett and Mohegan allies, who had never expected such a remorseless, comprehensive destruction of civilian populations within Mesopotamian-style native traditions. The catastrophic outcome of the Mystic Massacre completely broke the structural resistance of the Pequot Nation. The surviving remnants were relentlessly hunted through the swamps, with prominent warriors executed on the spot, and hundreds of captured women and children systematically sold into lifelong slavery in the West Indies, or forcefully divided among the victorious Mohegan and Narragansett clans. Under the strict terms of the subsequent Treaty of Hartford, the Pequot Nation was officially declared dissolved, its very name outlawed from public speech to permanently erase its political memory from the landscape. For the English colonists, this total victory set a powerful, dangerous precedent for extreme kinetic violence against indigenous communities, reinforcing a deep-seated ideological belief that their expansion was directly favored by the divine realm. The destruction of the Pequot completely opened the Connecticut River Valley to rapid, unchecked English settlement, allowing new Puritan towns to spread without immediate military resistance. Yet, this aggressive expansion only served to delay the ultimate reckoning, as the structural pressures of land loss, legal coercion, and cultural disruption continued to accumulate across the northern forests, steadily pushing the surviving native nations toward an even more destructive continental explosion. Following the systematic dismantling of the Pequot Nation, English settlements continued to spread across the northeastern landscape with a relentless, unchecked momentum. New Puritan towns, fortified outposts, and family farms multiplied rapidly across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and along the rugged coastlines of Rhode Island and Maine. For the indigenous nations who had witnessed the terrifying mechanics of total warfare at Mystic Fort, this multi-generational expansion presented a slow, suffocating existential crisis. Year after year, colonial grazing cattle trampled native cornfields, English fences carved up ancient hunting grounds, and imperial legal courts aggressively assumed jurisdictional sovereignty over Native American individuals. By the latter half of the 17th century, the structural strains between the expanding colonies and the remaining independent native nations reached a volatile breaking point. The strategic center of this brewing conflict was the Wampanoag Nation, inhabiting the coastal areas of present-day Massachusetts and Rhode Island. The supreme leadership of the Wampanoag was held by a dynamic, politically astute sachem named Metacom, whom the English colonists genericized and labeled as King Philip. Metacom was the proud son of Massasoit, the legendary paramount chieftain who had skillfully forged the original peace alliance with the starving Plymouth Pilgrims in 1621, ensuring their early survival. But the diplomatic landscape had been fundamentally transformed over the intervening decades. Metacom watched with deepening bitterness as the ancient tribal territories were systematically reduced to isolated pockets of land through coercive property sales, mounting debts to colonial merchants, and shifting boundary treaties. Furthermore, English authorities increasingly demonstrated a profound disrespect for native sovereignty. They demanded that independent tribal leaders submit directly to the legal jurisdiction of colonial courts, pay material fines in European currency, and systematically disarm their young warriors, even within their own ancestral domains. The volatile match that finally ignited this explosive reservoir of native resentment was struck in 1675. A native Christian convert named John Sassaman, who had been educated in a colonial academy and acted as a high-level translator and informer for the Plymouth authorities, was found mysteriously murdered under a sheet of ice. Utilizing a highly controversial application of English common law over sovereign native territory, Plymouth magistrates arrested, tried, and publicly executed 3 high-ranking Wampanoag men close to Metacom, completely bypassing the Sachem's traditional judicial authority. To Metacom and his Council of War, this aggressive act of judicial overreach was indisputable proof that the English meant to permanently strip away their remaining autonomy, leaving them no choice but ultimate submission or total revolutionary resistance. The resulting conflict, etched into global military literature as King Philip's War, unleashed a wave of kinetic destruction practically unparalleled in the early history of North America. Metacom successfully forged a powerful, multi-tribal alliance, uniting the Wampanoag with the fierce Narragansett, the Nipmuc, and various interior river valley tribes. Abandoning traditional pitched battles, the Allied native vanguard launched a brilliantly coordinated campaign of asymmetrical guerrilla warfare. They swept down upon isolated frontier settlements, burning dozens of English towns to the ground, ambushing colonial militia columns along narrow forest portages, and forcing thousands of panicked settlers to flee backward toward the fortified coastal hubs. The colonial governments responded with an equally merciless, scorched earth strategy, transforming the war into a brutal conflict of absolute attrition. Colonial militias, reinforced by friendly Mohegan scout units, systematically marched through the winter forests, destroying native food stores, burning unfortified winter villages, and ruthlessly executing non-combatants. The deep-seated paranoia of the era spared no one. Even the praying Indians, indigenous communities, who had converted to Christianity and adopted European agriculture, found themselves deeply distrusted and brutally confined by colonial authorities to desolate, freezing islands in Boston Harbor, where many perished from starvation and exposure. In terms of the percentage of casualties relative to the contemporary population, King Philip's War stands as one of the single most destructive and bloody conflicts in early American history. The structural losses were catastrophic on both sides. Dozens of English towns were completely laid waste or heavily damaged, and the colonial economy was pushed to the absolute brink of financial bankruptcy. But for the indigenous nations of southern New England, the ultimate outcome was a definitive, civilizational catastrophe from which they could never structurally recover. The turning point of the war arrived when colonial forces managed to isolate the Allied tribes from their seasonal food supplies, triggering widespread starvation, exhaustion, and internal factional defections among the clans. In the summer of 1676, Metacom's secret forest sanctuary was betrayed by a native informer. The proud sachem was shot down in a swamp by a colonial scout, his body brutally drawn and quartered, and his severed head displayed atop a wooden spike in Plymouth for 20 years as a terrifying monument of imperial victory. The military strength of the southern New England tribes was permanently broken. Thousands of survivors were executed or systematically sold into lifelong, brutal slavery in the sugar plantations of the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, while indigenous people remained on the land, holding on to their ancestral identities as best they could. The balance of power shifted decisively and permanently. English law and land claims now dominated the region completely, setting a harsh template of expansion that would soon ripple westward across the Middle Atlantic frontiers. As the intense violence of King Philip's War permanently shifted the balance of power in New England, a third great geographical region was rapidly maturing along the Middle Atlantic coast. This strategic band of territories, running between the Puritan towns of the north and the expansive tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake, would become famous across global history for a completely different civilizational model, radical cultural and economic diversity. The Middle Colonies did not revolve around a single, absolute religious orthodoxy or a dominant, soil-exhausting cash crop. Instead, they developed as dynamic, multi-ethnic crossroads of global trade, fluid migration, and structural coexistence. The historical genesis of this Middle Atlantic world begins not with the maritime ventures of the English crown, but with the mercantile ambitions of the Dutch Republic. In the early decades of the 17th century, the Dutch corporate state was one of the most commercially advanced, financially innovative, and seafaring societies in Western Europe. Seeking a substantial share of American wealth and a strategic base to challenge Iberian trade dominance, the merchants of Amsterdam successfully chartered the Dutch West India Company. Daring explorers in Dutch corporate service probed the eastern seaboard, searching for natural deep-water harbors and navigable rivers that could unlock the rich resources of the continental interior. The definitive breakthrough occurred when an English navigator in Dutch service, Henry Hudson, steered his ship, the Half Moon, into the great northern river that now bears his name. Sailing upstream through fertile shores and dense forests, Hudson recognized that this water highway was an exceptional commercial corridor. Dutch corporate planners instantly realized the region's supreme potential as a primary outlet for the international fur trade, where local agricultural surpluses could be exchanged for highly valuable pelts. To legally and militarily secure their territorial claims against European rivals, the Dutch officially established a permanent commercial colony named New Netherland. At the absolute mouth of the Hudson River, on a strategic island that would one day be covered by Manhattan's streets, the company constructed a bustling maritime hub named New Amsterdam. Farther upriver, near the site of modern Albany, they founded trading posts like Fort Orange to interface directly with the interior native networks. These settlements were never engineered as utopian religious experiments or dense agricultural communities. They functioned purely as corporate outposts of global commerce, meant to anchor Dutch imperial influence and channel thousands of beaver pelts directly into the competitive Atlantic trade networks. Consequently, the demographic composition of New Netherland was remarkably fluid, cosmopolitan, and mixed from its absolute outset. Company officials, deeply focused on maximizing corporate profits rather than enforcing cultural conformity, openly encouraged merchants, sailors, and displaced laborers from all geographical backgrounds to settle within the colony. Dutch, Walloon, German, French, Huguenot, Scandinavian, and even some of the earliest Jewish communities in North America made their homes along the crowded streets of New Amsterdam. In this transactional world, the powerful indigenous nations of the interior, particularly the Lenape along the lower river valleys and the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy farther north, were treated as indispensable diplomatic and commercial partners. High-quality beaver pelts traveled continuously from native hunters and tribal middlemen into Dutch corporate warehouses, where they were exchanged for European-manufactured iron tools, woolen cloth, and firearms. To stimulate higher agricultural production and reward large-scale financial investors, Dutch authorities instituted the patroon system, granting expansive feudal-style riverfront estates to wealthy individuals who could transport a set number of colonists at their own personal expense. However, this commercial pragmatic framework was periodically fractured by severe cultural misunderstandings and localized conflicts over land sovereignty. Disputes over livestock damage, trade credits, and boundary lines at times exploded into brutal frontier encounters, most notably Governor Keefe's War in the lower Hudson region, which severely strained relation lines with local Algonquian nations. Yet, despite these outbreaks of kinetic friction, Dutch colonial administrators generally approached native diplomacy in a deeply transactional, negotiated manner, fully recognizing that their relatively small military numbers required strategic cooperation rather than outright territorial conquest. While the Dutch corporate state successfully built this diverse commercial empire, English monarchs watched the rapid expansion of New Netherland with growing imperial jealousy and deep geopolitical concern. By the middle of the 17th century, English maritime power had increased substantially, and royal strategic planners were eager to tie the isolated patches of their North American coastline into a single, unified, and highly taxable imperial architecture. New Netherland, sitting precisely between the growing populations of New England and the Chesapeake, looked like an unwelcome, dangerous wedge of foreign territorial control that split the English world in two. In the year 1664, King Charles II resolved to forcefully eliminate this Dutch wedge. In a striking display of royal arrogance, the king officially granted the entire territory of New Netherland to his brother, James, the Duke of York, even though the land was still fully governed by the Dutch West India Company. A squadron of heavily armed English warships sailed boldly into the harbour of New Amsterdam, training their cannons directly at the unfortified town and demanding an immediate, unconditional surrender of the province. Recognizing that they were hopelessly outnumbered, completely cut off from European reinforcements, and facing internal defection from local merchants who preferred stable trade over military ruin, the Dutch colonial leadership, under Director General Peter Stuyvesant, formally accepted English rule without a single shot being fired. Under the negotiated terms of the bloodless transfer of command, the English crown promised to respect existing Dutch property rights, legal contracts, and religious liberties. New Netherland was instantly renamed New York, and the maritime hub of New Amsterdam transformed into New York City, seamlessly integrating the diverse commercial crossroads into the expanding architecture of the British Empire. Following the acquisition of New York, the Middle Atlantic region transformed rapidly as the English crown began carving out new proprietary domains to reward loyal noble families and expand imperial influence. To the south and west of the Hudson River Valley, portions of the vast territory were split off to become New Jersey, which developed as a highly decentralized patchwork of communities as differing waves of English, Dutch, and Scots-Irish migrants arrived. But the most distinctive, highly calculated, and structurally unique venture in the Middle Colonies took shape just to the west of the Delaware River, born out of a fascinating alliance between royal debt and radical religious idealism. This venture was the colony of Pennsylvania. The historic founder of this province was William Penn, a man who occupied an extraordinary position within 17th century English society. Penn was the highly educated son of a prominent royal admiral, Sir William Penn, which granted him access to the highest aristocratic circles of the realm. However, to the deep dismay of his family, the young Penn became a committed, zealous member of the Religious Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers. The Quakers held radical theological beliefs that challenged the hierarchical foundations of both the Church of England and the social order of the kingdom. They believed intensely in the concept of the inner light, a direct, personal experience of divine grace available to all human beings without the mediation of ordained ministers, elaborate church hierarchies, or traditional sacraments. Guided by this internal spiritual equality, Quakers refused to remove their hats before social superiors, used the plain pronouns thee and thou to address all persons regardless of rank, and adamantly refused to swear legal oaths or take up arms in military conflict. Their uncompromising testimonies against warfare, social deference, and state-mandated church tithes brought them into continuous friction with imperial authorities in England, leading to the widespread imprisonment, social harassment, and financial ruin of thousands of friends across the country. When the elder Admiral Penn passed away, the English crown found itself owing a massive financial debt to his estate. Seizing a spectacular strategic opportunity to relieve the royal treasury while simultaneously clearing England of a troublesome group of religious radicals, King Charles II granted the younger William Penn an expansive charter for a vast territory in North America in 1681. The king officially named the new proprietary province, Pennsylvania, in honor of the late admiral, granting Penn near princely executive authority to manage the territory. Penn looked upon this vast land grant not simply as a lucrative real estate investment, but as a divinely ordained opportunity to execute what he officially termed a holy experiment in fair governance, religious toleration, and social harmony. He envisioned Pennsylvania as a secure haven where people of all religious faiths could live and work together productively, free from the heavy hand of state coercion that had paralyzed Europe for generations. Penn immediately began drafting highly sophisticated, rationalized frames of government that explicitly guaranteed absolute liberty of conscience, established strict legal protections for individual property rights, and created a powerful, democratically elected colonial assembly, with real legislative authority over taxation. In the year 1682, Penn traveled across the Atlantic to supervise his holy experiment, instantly focusing his energy on the careful urban planning of the colony's primary commercial hub, which he named Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Rejecting the cramped, chaotic, and fire-prone layout of medieval London, Penn designed Philadelphia along a spacious, orderly grid pattern, featuring broad avenues, dedicated public green squares, and uniform brick houses to encourage public health and safety. The city's geographic positioning between two major navigable rivers allowed it to quickly develop into a premier international port, its wharves humming with commerce. Furthermore, Penn demonstrated an extraordinary, unprecedented standard of diplomacy regarding the indigenous populations of the region, particularly the various clans of the Lenape nation. Fully recognizing their ancestral sovereignty over the soil, Penn refused to permit any colonial settlements to take root until his agents had formally, fairly negotiated a sequence of land purchases with local native councils. He met personally with Lenape leaders, participated directly in traditional diplomatic gift-giving, and signed long-term peace covenants that established a remarkable era of peaceful coexistence along the Delaware frontier. While later generations of expansionist settlers would severely strain these agreements, Penn's early respectful approach successfully prevented the immediate, bloody frontier warfare that had devastated the infant colonies of New England and the Chesapeake. Driven by this unique combination of broad religious toleration, stable legal institutions, and spectacularly fertile soils, Pennsylvania experienced an unprecedented demographic explosion. Thousands of persecuted or economically marginalized people from across Western Europe streamed into the province. Massive waves of German-speaking migrants, including Mennonites, Amish, Lutherans, and Reformed Protestants, arrived to clear rich inland farming valleys, bringing with them advanced agricultural techniques that turned the colony into a primary breadbasket of the Atlantic world. Concurrently, thousands of Scots-Irish Presbyterians moved into the rugged backcountry frontiers, operating as a demographic buffer along the mountain borders. Together with English and Welsh Quakers, these diverse populations coexisted within a complex, pluralistic matrix, turning Pennsylvania into a vibrant civilizational laboratory that permanently reshaped how human communities balanced local autonomy with imperial authority. Driven by the remarkable demographic influx into Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, the Middle Colonies rapidly developed into the most economically productive and agriculturally sophisticated region in English America. The combination of remarkably fertile, alluvial soils, a moderate climate with predictable rainfall, and the diverse farming traditions brought by waves of European immigrants allowed these provinces to expand far beyond simple subsistence farming. Unlike the Chesapeake, which was entirely dominated by a single, volatile cash crop, the Middle Colonies established a resilient economy based on the mass production of grains, ultimately earning them permanent recognition across global history as the bread colonies. The unyielding backbone of this rural prosperity was the cultivation of wheat, rye, barley, and corn. In the rich inland valleys of Pennsylvania and northern New Jersey, German and Scots-Irish farmers cleared expansive tracts of land, utilizing highly advanced agricultural techniques such as systematic crop rotation, deep soil plowing, and the heavy use of livestock manure to maintain long-term soil productivity. The massive agricultural surpluses generated by these family farms required an immediate, sophisticated processing infrastructure. Consequently, the river networks of the Middle Colonies were quickly dotted with great stone merchant mills, where massive water-powered millstones ground raw wheat into high-quality flour, which could be easily packed into tight wooden barrels and preserved for long-distance transatlantic shipping. This booming agricultural productivity acted as a primary catalyst for the rapid growth of vibrant urban centers, transforming the ports of Philadelphia and New York City into major hubs of global maritime commerce. Along the busy wharves, rivers, and docks, an extensive merchant class emerged to manage the complex logistics of the Atlantic trade. Wealthy merchant houses coordinated the continuous export of local flour, salt meat, livestock, and lumber to the cash crop islands of the Caribbean, where prime agricultural land was exclusively reserved for sugar cultivation, leaving those colonies completely dependent on external food supplies. In return for these essential provisions, Middle Colony merchants brought back valuable molasses, sugar, silver currency, and an array of British manufactured goods, which were systematically distributed to inland shopkeepers. This dynamic commercial environment supported a remarkably diverse, highly independent class of urban artisans and skilled craftsmen within the city workshops. Blacksmiths, shipbuilders, carpenters, tailors, coopers, and silversmiths organized their labor through structured shops, training young apprentices and hiring migratory journeymen. These urban workshops were not merely places of physical manufacture, they served as central components of civic life, where craftsmen fiercely guarded their professional reputations and financial independence. The rapid expansion of international trade also stimulated the growth of domestic printing presses, which published an unprecedented volume of local newspapers, political pamphlets, and practical almanacs, fostering a highly literate, politically expressive urban culture where colonial policy was continuously debated. The social and cultural topography of these growing cities was profoundly shaped by the absolute absence of a single, dominant religious monopoly. While the Church of England maintained an official presence, particularly within the administrative circles of New York, it lacked the absolute institutional power to dictate public behavior or control civic assemblies. In Pennsylvania, Quaker meetings continued to guide community moral norms, but as the population expanded, non-Quaker merchants and secular political factions gained significant influence over local government. This unique absence of a centralized religious establishment forced the diverse populations to develop daily habits of legal compromise, transactional negotiation, and structural coexistence, laying the durable cultural foundations for a highly pluralistic civic society. However, this world of economic opportunity and religious toleration contained its own profound contradictions, manifested most visibly in the active presence of race-based slavery. While the Middle Colonies did not develop the massive rural plantation systems characteristic of the Deep South, enslaved men and women lived and worked in significant numbers across both rural farms and major port cities. In New York City, for example, a substantial portion of the total urban population was forcefully held in bondage during the 18th century. Enslaved laborers cleared city roads, handled heavy cargo along the active docks, built fortifications, and served within wealthy merchant households. The colonial assemblies passed increasingly restrictive slave codes to monitor native and black populations, revealing the deep structural anxieties that continuously ran through this diverse commercial world. By the time the Middle Colonies were establishing their diverse commercial networks, a much larger, far more systematic, and devastatingly dark institutional framework was tightening its permanent grip across the Atlantic world. This was the matrix of race-based, hereditary chattel slavery, a calculated legal and economic system that treated human beings exclusively as private property, turning their bodies, lives, and stolen labor into the absolute engine of enormous imperial wealth. In the southern mainland colonies and across the tropical islands of the Caribbean, this system created a distinctive, deeply stratified kind of society known as the Plantation South, permanently tying the future of the continent to a vast Atlantic web of merchant ships, volatile commodity markets, and coerced human labor. The structural roots of this transcontinental enterprise lay deep along the western and central coasts of Africa, where diverse, highly sophisticated kingdoms, empires, and local communities had managed extensive trade networks for generations. As the European demand for agricultural labor exploded across the Americas, driven primarily by the reality that indigenous populations had been catastrophically decimated by Old World diseases and warfare, Western merchants, royal companies, and local African raiders built a continuous, highly lucrative traffic in human captives. European traders established heavily fortified factories and coastal trading posts, systematically exchanging manufactured textiles, iron bars, alcohol, and firearms for millions of bound individuals who were marched in chains from the interior highlands. The Middle Passage, the terrifying transoceanic voyage across the volatile Atlantic Ocean, stood as one of the most horrific, dehumanizing, and deadly experiences in recorded human history. Captives were forcefully stripped, branded, and crammed into incredibly tight, unventilated spaces below the wooden ship decks, often chained together for months with little air, poor nutrition, and virtually no sanitation. Raging epidemics of dysentery and smallpox spread with absolute velocity through the holds, causing immense human suffering and a staggering loss of life before the vessels ever made landfall. Those who survived this biological and psychological trauma were unloaded onto auction blocks in Caribbean and mainland ports, systematically sold to the highest bidders to fund the expansion of global agrarian fortunes. While the early tobacco planters of Virginia and Maryland had relied heavily on poor European indentured servants, changing economic conditions in Britain and a desire for more absolute control over their workforce encouraged a massive shift toward enslaved African labor during the late 17th century. Concurrently, new colonies farther to the south were being systematically founded with race-based slavery built directly into their administrative and economic structures from their absolute origin. The most prominent example of this deliberate institutional engineering was the colony of Carolina, established under a vast royal charter granted by King Charles II to a group of influential noble proprietors. The historical topography of Carolina was profoundly shaped by its deep, direct connections to the island of Barbados, a tiny English colony in the Caribbean that had rapidly become one of the wealthiest sugar-producing zones on the globe. On the crowded plantations of Barbados, a small, heavily armed white elite managed an uncompromisingly brutal system of sugar cultivation overseen by an enslaved African majority. When Barbadian planters, adventurous younger sons, and their corporate associates moved northward to settle the Carolina mainland, they did not arrive as simple wilderness pioneers. They brought with them a fully mature, deeply rigid way of thinking about land extraction, forced labor, and absolute racial control. Ambitious Carolina planters immediately sought a highly profitable cash crop that could mirror the immense economic success of Caribbean sugar. After early experiments exporting cattle, timber, and naval stores like pitch and tar back to the West Indies, they turned their absolute energy toward the large-scale cultivation of rice, and later, a valuable blue dye crop known as indigo. The development of rice cultivation, especially across the low country of what would become South Carolina and Georgia, depended fundamentally on the specialized knowledge, technical skills, and generational expertise of enslaved Africans who had been violently captured from traditional rice-growing regions along the West African coast. These enslaved workers possessed an advanced understanding of how to clear thick river swamps, construct complex networks of wooden dikes and sluice gates, and meticulously manage tidal waters to flood and drain the mudfields in precise seasonal cycles. While wealthy white planters claimed the immense financial profits from this international export trade, the entire technological and physical infrastructure of the rice empire was built and operated by the people whose backs bent daily in the fields. The low-country environment was exceptionally harsh and deadly, as the stagnant, swampy waters bred swarms of mosquitoes that spread rampant malaria, forcing enslaved populations to labor for grueling hours under a burning sun with minimal protection. Faced with high mortality rates across the plantations, corporate owners treated human lives as replaceable units of production, continuously importing a massive volume of new African captives to expand their operations. Consequently, by the early decades of the 18th century, the number of enslaved Africans and African Americans in the coastal low country far exceeded the total number of white colonists, creating a stark demographic imbalance that deeply terrified the ruling class. To protect their wealth and maintain absolute social order against the constant threat of collective resistance, the colonial assemblies systematically passed incredibly strict, comprehensive slave codes. These legal codes officially defined enslaved human beings as absolute chattel property, severely restricted their freedom of physical movement, and authorized the use of brutal corporal punishments, mutilation, or public execution to suppress any signs of disobedience or independent organization. Every white citizen, regardless of economic class, was legally conscripted into mandatory militia patrols to search for runaways, monitor native pathways, and forcefully break up independent gatherings, systematically binding the white population together across class lines through the shared practice of racialized control. Despite this omnipresent apparatus of colonial state violence, enslaved individuals persistently found creative ways to assert their basic humanity, preserve their cultural heritage, and actively resist their condition. On the large, isolated, low-country plantations where African-born laborers formed the absolute majority, elements of diverse tribal languages, musical rhythms, and ancestral spiritual beliefs blended beautifully with new American realities to create vibrant, resilient Creole cultures, most famously manifested in the Gullah and Geechee communities of the Sea Islands. Furthermore, active resistance periodically exploded into open, violent rebellion, most dramatically in the Stono Rebellion of 1739, when a courageous group of enslaved men seized gunpowder weapons, raised banners, and attempted to fight their way southward towards Spanish Florida, where authorities offered legal freedom to fugitive slaves to strategically weaken British power. Although these uprisings were invariably crushed with overwhelming military force, their occurrence proved that the desire for absolute liberation was an unquenchable flame, running directly beneath the wealthy, polished surface of the plantation South. Beneath the sweeping movements of transatlantic trade, migrating populations, and expanding plantation systems, daily life across colonial America was anchored by structures of law and governance. The 13 mainland colonies did not grow in absolute isolation, nor did they operate under a single, uniform system of administration. Instead, they were structurally bound to the English Crown and Parliament through an evolving matrix of royal charters, imperial regulations, and local legislative compromises. To understand how this colonial world functioned, one must look closely at these institutional frameworks and at how ordinary people understood their rights as subjects of a distant king. Historically, the English colonies took shape under three distinct administrative models, each distributing political authority in its own unique way. First were the charter colonies, such as Connecticut and Rhode Island, where the Crown had granted explicit, highly flexible documents giving broad powers of local self-government to the settlers. Second were the proprietary colonies, including Pennsylvania and Maryland, which were officially entrusted to individual noblemen or prominent families who exercised near-princely authority over their vast territorial domains. Third were the royal colonies, such as Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York, which were ruled directly by the British monarch through an appointed royal governor. Over the decades, as the Crown systematically revoked or modified original corporate charters to centralize its control, a majority of the provinces transitioned into the royal category. Yet the earlier traditions of local legal autonomy left a permanent mark. In a typical royal colony, the political anatomy was defined by a delicate, continuously negotiated balance among three primary institutions. At the apex sat the royal governor, who acted as the personal earthly representative of the king, holding executive powers to command the local militia, dissolve political assemblies, and veto unwanted legislation. The governor presided over an appointed advisory council, which functioned as an upper legislative house and a high court of appeals. Alongside these Crown-appointed officials stood the lower house of the legislature, the elected Colonial Assembly, chosen by eligible voters, typically free white men, who met specific property ownership qualifications. The Assembly held absolute power over local taxation and the initiation of domestic laws. This control over the public purse gave local representatives a powerful tool to continuously check the ambitions of royal governors, as assemblies could simply withhold executive salaries or funding for imperial projects until their grievances were addressed. At the local municipal level, the practical business of everyday life was managed through highly effective, decentralized structures that varied sharply by region. In the compact, family-centered towns of New England, the town meeting functioned as the absolute center of civic life. Periodically, the male inhabitants of a community would gather openly inside the local meeting house to discuss and vote on immediate communal affairs, how to fund public schools, maintain roads, regulate livestock fences, or levy local taxes. In the scattered, plantation-dominated landscape of the Chesapeake and the Deep South, where compact towns were rare, governance was organized through county courts and parish vestries. Justices of the peace, drawn exclusively from the ranks of the wealthy planter gentry, met regularly to adjudicate minor legal disputes, oversee infrastructure, and enforce social behavior. This localized experience, whether conducted in a New England town hall or a southern county courthouse, gave thousands of ordinary colonists a direct, continuous participation in public debate and civic decision-making. Through these active institutions, the free white populations of colonial America developed a profound attachment to the historic concept of the liberties of Englishmen. They did not view themselves as second-class subjects or inhabitants of conquered territories. They believed with absolute certainty that they possessed the same traditional constitutional rights as any citizen living in London. They continuously pointed to foundational English legal texts, like the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights, fiercely arguing that their right to trial by jury, security of private property, and representation in any legislative body that levied taxes upon them was an unalterable birthright protection that could not be stripped away by the Crown. However, this passionate celebration of legal liberty was characterized by profound, systemic inequalities. Political participation was strictly restricted by property ownership qualifications, meaning that poorer labourers, landless tenants, and free black individuals had virtually no voice in colonial assemblies. Married women were systematically subjected to the traditional legal doctrine of coverture, under which their independent legal identity, property rights, and civil existence were entirely absorbed into those of their husbands upon marriage. Enslaved Africans and African Americans possessed absolutely no recognized standing or human rights under the strict slave codes, while indigenous nations operating along the borders found their ancestral land rights completely denied by colonial courts, illustrating how the practice of freedom for some rested directly upon the structural subjugation of others. By the early decades of the 18th century, daily life across the British colonies had settled into well-established, highly predictable cultural routines. In every region, organized churches stood at the absolute center of community life, their ordained ministers serving as respected members of the traditional, educated elite. On the surface, religious devotion appeared firmly woven into the fabric of everyday existence. Yet, beneath this polished exterior of institutional stability, a deep and spreading spiritual unease was quietly paralyzing many colonial congregations. Thousands of ordinary settlers increasingly felt that their religious lives had grown cold, formal, and distant, dominated by dry, intellectual lectures that completely failed to satisfy the emotional needs of the human soul. Into this spiritually stagnant environment stepped a dynamic new movement of emotional revitalization that global historians now recognize as the Great Awakening. This sweeping wave of religious revivals did not originate from a centralized administrative plan. Instead, it erupted spontaneously across multiple frontiers, driven by an innovative, highly expressive style of open-air preaching that emphasized immediate personal conversion, intense emotional experience, and the absolute necessity of an inward change of heart. Revivalist ministers boldly traveled from village to village, passionately arguing that formal church membership, infant baptism, and a respectable social life were completely insufficient for salvation. An individual had to actively feel the crushing weight of their own sins, seek direct, divine forgiveness, and undergo a profound psychological transformation known as the new birth. The foundational intellectual champion of this spiritual awakening was Jonathan Edwards, a highly educated, deeply philosophical minister who governed the Congregational Church of Northampton in western Massachusetts. Edwards believed with absolute intensity that true religion must move the human affections, the deep emotional core of the heart, rather than simply engaging the logical mind. In the 1730s, Edwards began to deploy a sequence of extraordinarily vivid, terrifying sermons that forced his listeners to confront the raw reality of their spiritual vulnerability. His most celebrated historical sermon, delivered under the haunting title "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," masterfully utilized powerful poetic imagery to describe humanity dangling precariously over the flames of eternal judgment by nothing more than a slender thread. The emotional impact of his preaching was immediate and historic. Entire congregations wept openly, collapsed in the aisles from spiritual distress, and experienced intense, life-altering conversions that rapidly spread to neighboring river valley towns. Concurrently, a remarkably similar spiritual stir commenced within the Presbyterian churches of the Middle Colonies, led by zealous, reform-minded ministers like the Tennant family, who openly attacked the traditional religious establishment. These revivalists boldly criticized the settled conservative clergy, branding them as dead ministers who possessed advanced university degrees, but completely lacked true spiritual power or vital faith. This direct, unprecedented challenge to traditional religious authority quickly triggered deep, permanent fractures across multiple Protestant denominations, systematically dividing congregations into two fiercely competing factions: the New Lights, who enthusiastically championed the emotional, experiential style of the revivals, and the Old Lights, who firmly defended traditional church hierarchies, rationalized theology, and proper, dignified ecclesiastical order. The Great Awakening transformed into a truly continental, transatlantic phenomenon with the spectacular arrival of George Whitefield, a young Anglican minister from Britain who possessed an extraordinary talent for theatrical public speaking. Whitefield recognized that the crowded interior of traditional churches could not possibly hold the massive, curious audiences that gathered to witness his campaigns. Consequently, he systematically bypassed the established pulpits, boldly preaching in open fields, crowded town squares, and busy maritime wharves to audiences that regularly numbered in the thousands. Whitefield possessed a magnificent, resonant voice that could easily reach the margins of a vast crowd, and he managed his public delivery with the emotional force of a master actor, raising and lowering his tone to move his listeners to collective tears. Whitefield executed a sequence of extensive preaching tours that systematically covered nearly every province of British America, effectively turning localized, isolated revivals into a single, shared continental experience. His massive audiences cut directly across long-standing social boundaries, bringing together wealthy merchants, poor agrarian laborers, women, and marginalized populations into a singular, emotionally charged space. For many ordinary colonists, who had spent their lives feeling entirely ignored or judged by the traditional elite establishments, Whitefield's direct, simple, and intensely personal appeals offered a magnificent sense of spiritual validation and dignity. This egalitarian logic of the revivals introduced profound, long-term modifications into the wider social and political psychology of colonial society. By elevating the absolute authority of individual conscience and personal spiritual experience above the institutional judgments of university-educated clergymen, the movement systematically weakened the unquestioned prestige of traditional social elites. If a humble frontier farmer, a poor widow, or a bound laborer could independently discern the divine will and experience immediate grace, the traditional assumption that social rank alone commanded absolute respect began to slowly erode. Furthermore, the Great Awakening created the very first shared, continent-wide cultural conversation across North America, establishing extensive networks of communication, travel, and print literature that completely ignored traditional provincial borders. Colonists from New England to the far southern backwoods found themselves reacting to the same charismatic figures, reading the same published journals, and debating the exact same structural questions concerning individual liberty and spiritual authority. Although these revivalist preachers focused their absolute energy on the salvation of the soul rather than the reform of the state, their fiery campaigns quietly trained colonial minds to question established institutions, permanently laying the critical psychological and organizational groundwork for future continental cooperation on monumental political issues. By the middle of the 18th century, the British colonies in North America had successfully transitioned from fragile, isolated beachheads into mature, expanding societies with their own bustling commercial networks, complex legal codes, and powerful legislative assemblies. Yet, their long-term security was suddenly and profoundly threatened as the intense, multi-generational global rivalry between Great Britain and Catholic France reached an explosive climax. The resulting conflict, which historians call the 7 Years' War, and the colonists labeled the French and Indian War, would systematically redraw the political map of the continent and quietly set off a chain of catastrophic imperial decisions that permanently turned colonial loyalty into revolutionary anger. The immediate structural cause of the war lay in the rich, contested interior of the continent, specifically around the strategically vital Ohio River Valley. For British land companies and westward moving settlers, this valley represented an exceptional opportunity for territorial expansion and economic enrichment. For French administrators in Canada and Louisiana, control of the Ohio Country was an absolute necessity to physically connect their northern and southern river networks, and to systematically block British commerce from subduing their sovereign indigenous trade partners. As both empires aggressively rushed to construct competing chains of wooden forts and trading outposts, the localized friction rapidly turned into an international crisis. The very first sparks of open warfare flew when a young, ambitious officer from Virginia named George Washington was dispatched into the wilderness to deliver an ultimatum to the French garrison at Fort Duquesne near present-day Pittsburgh. Following a sequence of chaotic forest skirmishes and the catastrophic surrender of Washington's forces at Fort Necessity, Great Britain and France officially mobilized their regular armies for a total, continent-spanning campaign. The early years of the conflict were characterized by absolute military disasters for the British Crown, as rigid European troop formations were repeatedly ambushed and decimated by highly mobile French soldiers and their astutely coordinated Native American allies, who expertly utilized the rugged forest terrain to their advantage. Faced with complete ruin, the British government in London implemented a sweeping change of leadership under the energetic minister William Pitt the Elder. Pitt made a calculated strategic decision to pour massive amounts of raw capital into the North American theatre, heavily subsidizing colonial militias, sending thousands of disciplined British regular troops across the Atlantic, and deploying the Royal Navy to effectively cut off French supply networks. The massive geopolitical tide systematically turned, culminating in the spectacular fall of Quebec on the Plains of Abraham, which effectively broke the back of French imperial power across Canada forever. Under the definitive terms of the subsequent Treaty of Paris in 1763, France officially surrendered virtually all of its territorial claims on the North American mainland, transferring Canada and the vast lands east of the Mississippi River entirely to the British Crown, while Spain ceded Florida to Britain. On parchment maps across the globe, the eastern half of the continent now appeared as an unchallengeable, overwhelmingly British domain. Colonial merchants, land speculators, and frontier families celebrated with magnificent bonfires and toasts, confidently expecting that this triumph marked the dawn of a glorious golden age of unchecked westward expansion and imperial partnership. But the immense cost of this global victory instantly introduced a sequence of unyielding structural problems that fractured the delicate balance of the empire. Great Britain emerged from the war, burdened with an absolute national debt that threatened to paralyze its treasury, while the maintenance of permanent military garrisons along the newly won frontiers created an expensive, ongoing liability. British imperial planners looked across the Atlantic and concluded with complete clarity that the American colonists, who had been heavily protected by the regular army and paid minimal taxes compared to citizens at home, must begin to systematically bear a larger share of the financial burdens of the realm. The opening blow in this new centralizing policy was struck when the British Crown issued the Proclamation of 1763, drawing a strict administrative line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and officially forbidding colonists from settling west of that boundary without direct royal permission. This measure was engineered to stabilize relations with remaining indigenous nations who had launched a massive, coordinated frontier uprising known as Pontiac's War to defend their homelands against aggressive land grabs. To the colonists, however, this proclamation felt like an absolute betrayal. They had shed blood and paid taxes in the imperial war explicitly to unlock the western interior, only to find a distant, authoritarian government closing the frontier doors in their faces. The structural alienation deepened rapidly as Parliament moved from regulating trade to imposing direct internal taxes without the consent of the colonial assemblies, launching a sequence of measures that began with the Sugar Act and culminated in the historic Stamp Act. This law required that a wide range of everyday printed items, legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, and playing cards carry a special stamped paper purchased exclusively from royal officials. In America, this act struck a powerful, highly sensitive political nerve. It was not merely the financial cost of the stamps that enraged the population. It was the fundamental constitutional principle of representation. Colonists passionately insisted that under the traditional common law rights of Englishmen, they could never be taxed without their own consent, which could only be legitimately given through their own elected representatives within local assemblies. They vehemently rejected the claim that they were virtually represented by a parliament in London that sat thousands of miles away and possessed no true understanding of their local conditions. Resistance to the Stamp Act took on multiple, highly organized forms. Elite lawyers drafted formal declarations of rights. Merchants forged strict non-importation agreements that devastated British exporters, and ordinary townspeople organized underground groups called the Sons of Liberty to forcefully intimidate stamp distributors, burning effigies and ransacking the homes of royal officials to prevent the law from ever operating in reality. Although Parliament backed down and repealed the Stamp Act under economic pressure, it immediately passed the Declaratory Act, asserting an absolute right to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever, quickly following up with the Townshend duties on imported commodities like glass, paint, paper, and tea. This unyielding cycle of imperial taxation, colonial boycotts, and military enforcement turned the port of Boston into a highly volatile laboratory of resistance. The provocative deployment of regular red-coated soldiers to occupy a civilian town during peacetime triggered deep community paranoia, exploding into the tragic street violence of the Boston Massacre, where nervous soldiers fired into an angry crowd of townspeople. A brief, fragile lull in the storm was permanently shattered when Parliament passed the Tea Act, designed to subtly collect a symbolic tax while rescuing a powerful corporate trading enterprise. Colonial patriots recognized that accepting the corporate tea meant surrendering their core constitutional principles. In December of 1773, a group of disciplined Bostonians, disguised loosely as Mohawk Indians, boarded the ships and executed the Boston Tea Party, methodically, systematically destroying thousands of pounds of valuable tea by pouring it directly into the dark harbour waters. The retaliatory response from London was swift, furious, and uncompromising. Parliament instantly passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists branded as the Intolerable Acts, closing the port of Boston entirely, dissolving the traditional town meetings, and placing Massachusetts under severe military rule. Rather than isolating New England as intended, these punitive measures served to catalyze an unprecedented standard of continental solidarity. From across the colonies, food, supplies, and political support streamed into the besieged town of Boston, and committees of correspondence rapidly coordinated a general meeting of all provinces in Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress. When the delegates gathered in the fall of 1774, they stood on a narrow, dangerous ledge between imperial reconciliation and open, revolutionary war. They issued a sophisticated Declaration of Rights, formed a strict continental association to halt all trade with Britain, and petitioned King George III to intercede against the tyranny of his ministers. But at the exact same time, ordinary citizens across the country began to quietly store gunpowder, melt down lead, and drill local militia units, training themselves to move as Minutemen at a moment's notice. The absolute transformation from peaceful political protest to kinetic armed revolution was finally consummated in the early morning darkness of April 19, 1775. A column of British regulars marched secretly out of Boston, explicitly commanded to disarm the countryside by seizing colonial military supplies in the town of Concord. As the sun rose over the village green of Lexington, they encountered a small, silent line of local militiamen who stood together to defend their community. A single anonymous musket shot cracked through the morning air, a historic blast permanently remembered across global literature as the shot heard round the world. The resulting skirmish instantly unleashed a fierce, chaotic battle that raged all along the road back to Boston, as ordinary farmers stood behind stone walls and fences to fire upon the retreating regular troops. Within a few short months, the newly formed Second Continental Congress appointed George Washington to command a unified Continental Army, and the bloody heights of Bunker Hill proved that the untried colonial forces could stand up against seasoned regulars. The ancient, familiar imperial order was broken past any hope of repair. Driven by the eloquent common-sense arguments of writers who demanded a clean break from monarchy, the colonies stood proudly on the threshold of an uncharted future, ready to declare their absolute independence before the entire global community and turn a regional revolt into a timeless revolution. And with that, the pages of history for tonight are officially closed. We have journeyed together across vast oceans, through untamed wilderness, and stood on the very edge of a revolution that changed the world forever. But now, as the echoes of the past fade into the evening, it is time to return to the quiet of the present. Thank you for listening and for walking through these timeless stories with me tonight. May your mind be at ease, and may your dreams be peaceful. Let go of the worries of today, for tomorrow brings a brand new dawn. Good night, everyone. Sleep well, and I will see you in the next chapter.